Stories Between Us anthology, where Black queer men's lives, love, and tension take center stage. They'd been on the space station long enough for everything to start feeling like rhythm. Not romantic rhythm, nothing up here was built for romance, but routine that lived in the body. Meals squeezed from pouches. Work that demanded steady hands and steady nerves. Calls down to Earth that arrived slightly delayed, like the planet was always a beat behind. 73 days was long enough to learn each other without meaning to. Ellis knew Maze's habits the way he knew the station's sounds. The pause before he answered mission control, the soft hum he made when he was thinking, the way his shoulders squared when he was tired but refusing to show it. He knew Maze worked with a kind of reverence, like every latch, every panel, every diagnostic mattered because it kept them alive. Maze knew Ellis's control wasn't just leadership, it was armor. Commander Ellis moved through the station like the rules were written under his skin. He was disciplined, clean, precise, the kind of man who spoke only what was necessary and still somehow filled the room. The kind of man who didn't ask for anything because asking for things made you weak. Or at least, that's how he was raised. Maze had stopped calling it intimidating around day 30. Somewhere between shared meals and shared silences, they became something more intimate, more familiar, more predictable. A steady connection that seemed to work as they gravitated in space. They were two of only 3 Black astronauts assigned to this rotation. Then they became the only 2 left when the others cycled out. That fact was never said openly, but it was the truth. 2 men in a place that wasn't built for either of them. 2 men sharing recycled air and responsibility, carrying the same unspoken understanding. You don't get to fall apart up here. Not even if you're falling in love with your commander. Which meant that when something began to shift between them, neither of them talked about it. It showed up in small ways at first. Ellis lingering in the doorway of the galley an extra second when Maze laughed at a joke during a check-in call with the team on Earth. Maze offering Ellis the last packet of coffee without being asked. Their eyes meeting during system checks. Holding too long, then snapping away like instinct. Arguments about music in their shared headphones. Silence afterward felt like longing instead of nothing. Touch was rare up here. Not forbidden, just avoidable. The space station was built to keep bodies apart. Rails for hands, safety straps for feet, enough space to move about without colliding into another man's body. So when their hands touched for the first time, it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. The system glitch came late in the day, right after the station's light switched to night mode. Ellis was going over the return plan to Earth again, even though nothing had changed. Maze had been doing a last pass on the thermal panel diagnostics. They were tired in the way only space made you tired. Not heavy, but hollowed out, like your body was a tool that never got to fully power down. The message from mission control came with that familiar delay, a voice like a ghost through static. After the system reboot, one of the sleep pod chambers didn't come back online properly. Until the schedule reset, Ellis and Maze were assigned to share sleep pod chamber C. Ellis's jaw tightened even before he spoke. Not because sharing a sleep chamber was inappropriate. Crew members did it sometimes when needed. They both confirmed they got the message from mission control. There was a moment of silence after the message ended. The 2 of them suspended in the corridor like punctuation. Ellis looked at Maze. Maze met his eyes and stared. Just long enough to make the moment land. Ellis felt the familiar pull of something he didn't want to feel, and did what he always did when that feeling surfaced. He deflected.
"Get your sleep kit," Ellis said. Mays nodded once. "Already got mine set for our sleep chamber."
Ellis turned and didn't allow himself to think about what it meant that Mays had already anticipated what he was about to say.
The corridor lights dimmed gradually as the station transitioned into sleep mode.
Their sleep chamber was small, smaller than Ellis remembered. A tight capsule of air and restraint straps and panels, meant for rest but never comfort. It wasn't a room so much as a pocket carved into the station. Mays floated in first, careful and quiet. Ellis followed. The hatch sealed behind them with a smooth hydraulic sound that made Ellis's stomach drop. Mays slid his bag into a corner restraint and secured it with quick, practiced movements. Ellis watched for half a second longer than necessary before forcing himself to turn away. He anchored himself into his own sleep restraints and brought up the panel readouts, scrolling through them with more focus than they deserved. The numbers were familiar. He knew them already, but they gave him something solid to look at. Something that wasn't Mays standing a few feet away in sleep clothes, leaving almost nothing to the imagination. Mays had changed into the standard station sleep gear, thin, dark fabric meant for temperature control, not modesty. The material clung lightly to his arms and chest, outlining muscle built from work, not training. His legs looked long in zero gravity, knees bent slightly as he floated, bare feet hooked under a strap. Ellis did not let himself stare. After Mays finished securing his sleep kit and drifted toward his own restraints, he stopped. He didn't strap in. He hovered there instead, hands folded loosely near his chest like he was waiting for instruction or permission. Ellis noticed. The lights dimmed another degree as the station settled fully into night mode. The red glow softened the space, blurring the hard edges of metal and paneling. It caught the curve of Mays's cheek, the strong line of his jaw, the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath the thin fabric. In the red light, Mays looked more open than usual, stripped of uniform, stripped of posture. His lips were relaxed, full in a way Ellis had never given himself time to notice. His arms floated slightly away from his body, sleeves riding up just enough to expose forearms marked with faint lines and muscle. They talked about Earth at first because it was easy, about real beds, about gravity pulling you down instead of letting you float. Ellis spoke like he always did when he was nervous, practical, and measured, listing things he'd miss as if they were items on a checklist. Mays listened, nodded, filled in the gaps without correcting him. But the conversation didn't stay on logistics. It slid slowly into how loud life felt down on Earth, how crowded it was, how you had to be too many versions of yourself at once just to survive it. Mays talked about the relief of quiet in space, about how up here the world narrowed to what was right in front of you, just your hands and your work. Ellis recognized himself in the description before he realized he was being described. They learned things in fragments, that Ellis had been carrying responsibility since before he had language for it. That Mays noticed more than people gave him credit for, especially when it came to Ellis. That neither of them rested easily, even when they slept. While they talked, Ellis became aware of the body on Mays in a way he hadn't allowed himself before. The way the sleep shirt clung lightly to his chest when he inhaled. The strength in his arms. The long line of his legs floating just slightly apart, relaxed but grounded. Mays, in turn, saw how cute Ellis was in his smile and the discipline in the way he held himself. His shoulders straining against the thin fabric, the quiet authority in the way he occupied space even when he wasn't speaking. The longer they talked, the closer they drifted towards each other. They began to feel more than affection, not just want, but that low pull that tightens in your gut. At some point, the distance between them disappeared without either of them deciding it should. Ellis knew he should stop it. He knew the rules, the lines, the consequences waiting back on Earth.
Mays drifted closer, slow and careful, like he approached everything.
Somewhere in that quiet, their hands found each other without instruction, fingers brushing, then curling, then holding not tight, not desperate, like something remembered in a dream. Ellis felt it before he understood it. The steady weight of another man choosing him, anchoring himself there. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their bodies aligned naturally in the open air, arms finding familiar places, chests close enough to share warmth. It felt instinctive, almost tender. Two men holding each other in a place where gravity didn't exist, where nothing pulled them apart. The quiet intimacy of being held and not holding back.
And then Ellis leaned in and kissed Mays. It was soft. Mays had warm, full lips that yielded easily against Ellis. The kiss deepened, slow and unhurried, lips parting, fitting together with an ease that shocked them both. Kissing another man like this felt like a wish being granted retroactively, something they hadn't known to ask for, but somehow had always been waiting on. It wasn't frantic or consuming, it was healing. The kind of kiss that settled into the body and told it everything was going to be all right. Mays sighed into his mouth, the sound soft and real, and Ellis felt it move straight through him. When they finally pulled back, it was only enough to breathe. Ellis rested his forehead against the chest of Mays, hands still firm at his back. His voice was low, barely there. We should loosen these straps and unzip our sleep suits. Mays smiled faintly, breath warm between them. Yes, Commander. I will if you want me to. They didn't rush. Fingers worked carefully at zippers, the sound of fabric opening loud in the small chamber. Sleep suits loosened, peeled back, the cool air touching their bare skin. They resecured the restraints afterward, but closer this time with their bodies set with an intention. When they settled back together, bare skin pressed to bare skin, the warmth was immediate and grounding. Ellis wrapped an arm around Mays. Mays tucked himself in closer, fitting like he'd always known where to go. Their bodies held each other, and in that suspended closeness, naked, breathing, bound gently together, everything ahead of them felt heavy with promise.
They didn't talk about it the next morning. That was the first rule they made without speaking. No language that could turn a moment into evidence. Ellis woke before the space station's lights shifted from night mode to daytime mode. The sleep chamber was still dim, washed in that low red glow that made everything feel like it belonged to a different world. For a second, he forgot where he was and who he was supposed to be. He forgot the protocols. He forgot the rank stitched onto his uniform. Mays was anchored beside him in the sleeping restraints, close enough that Ellis could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, not pressed like a performance, not clinging,
like he'd always been meant to be within reach. Ellis stared at the ceiling panel above them, jaw tight, throat tight, lungs refusing to take a full breath. He had spent a lifetime training himself out of reactions. His career was built on control and precision. Up here, control was oxygen. And yet, the one thing he couldn't regulate was the way his body had decided to remember. He didn't replay the night in images. He replayed it in sensations. The sound of Mays exhaling when Ellis stopped pretending he could keep distance. The shift of weight in zero gravity when Mays came closer without forcing it. The simple fact of being held without the world watching. Ellis wanted his hands to move. They didn't. He kept them flat against his own chest, fingers curled slightly like he was gripping something invisible. Mays stirred in the restraints, a subtle movement that made Ellis's heartbeat stumble. Mays didn't open his eyes right away. He breathed in, deeper, like he was checking whether the air still belonged to them. When Mays finally blinked awake, his gaze found Ellis's without searching. It was worse than words, because it was an answer. Mays didn't smile. He didn't reach. He didn't do anything that would make it easy. He just looked at Ellis with that quiet, steady attention, like a mechanic listening for a problem others couldn't hear. Ellis felt exposed. Mays's lips parted slightly as if he might speak, then closed again. He swallowed. Ellis understood. They were still in the station. The station had cameras. The station had logs. The station had a way of turning private human moments into data points if you weren't careful. Mays shifted his gaze toward the hatch. Back to Ellis. A small nod, barely there. A check-in without language. Ellis returned the nod. Then he did what he always did when his emotions threatened to become real. He moved to procedure. "Morning," he said, voice even, controlled. Mays's throat worked once. "Morning?" It wasn't affectionate. It wasn't cold. It was exactly what it needed to be. Neutral enough to survive. Ellis unhooked himself from the restraints with slow, deliberate movements and drifted toward the hygiene station. He kept his back turned longer than necessary. He didn't trust his face. He didn't trust what might happen if he looked at Mays again too soon. He brushed his teeth like it was a mission-critical task. When he glanced in the small mirror, he looked like himself again, Commander Ellis. Clean lines. Eyes that didn't give away anything. But he felt different. He felt like someone had placed a hand on a part of him that hadn't been touched in years and reminded him it existed. In the galley an hour later, the station was awake in its quiet way. Systems humming. Lights bright. Air moving through vents like an invisible tide. The day's schedule pulled at them with familiar gravity, checklists, reports, final calibrations for descent in a few days. Mays floated in after Ellis, strapped in across the table, and opened a meal pack with practiced calm. He didn't look up right away. Ellis didn't either. They ate like men who hadn't shared the same air in the dark just hours ago. Ellis tried to focus on the day's tasks. He told himself, just 3 more days on the space station. Just 3 more days. But the harder he tried to push the night out of his head, the more it came back to him in fragments as sensations all throughout his body. A memory rose uninvited. The voice of Mays in the dark the night before, saying, half joking, that he wished they could be like this on Earth. Ellis remembered the way it had knocked the air out of him.
The way he'd answered without thinking and said, "Me too." Like the truth had been sitting there all along. The memory faded as quickly as it came, leaving a tightness behind. Across the station, Mays was working through a systems check of his own, hands steady, movements precise. He told himself to focus, but every time he leaned into his work, his body betrayed him. A flash of laughter from last night surfaced, the two of them drifting awkwardly, tangled in restraints, laughing at how absurd it was. "We're really fucking in space," one of them had said, and they'd both lost it. Laughter bubbling up between kisses, the ridiculousness somehow making it sweeter. The kind of laughter that came from relief, from joy, from knowing this would be a story they'd carry forever. Mays smiled to himself before he could stop it, then shook his head and tightened his focus. Later, they ended up in the maintenance bay together. Ellis held the tablet while Mays adjusted the sensors, their bodies closer than necessary in the narrow corridor. Ellis read out numbers, while Mays worked with that quiet confidence that made everything seem solvable. Ellis noticed again, against his will, the careful strength in Mays, his hands and the ease of his movements. Mays tightened the fastener and let out a breath when it finally settled into place. Ellis checked the readout and confirmed the numbers without looking up, his focus fixed on the tablet like it could keep him anchored. Mays noticed the distance anyway. The way Ellis hadn't spoken beyond what was necessary. The way his attention stayed locked on the work, as if silence could be used like a tool. Ellis told himself they were doing their jobs, that this was what they always did. Kept things professional. They worked the rest of the day in that suspended tension, the kind that doesn't scream but never stops vibrating. Every time Ellis thought he'd gotten it under control, Mays would say something small and true, and Ellis would feel himself tilt. That night, Ellis tried to sleep alone. He chose a different sleep chamber. He told himself it was discipline. He told himself it was leadership. He told himself it was respect for his girlfriend back on Earth. Mays was also in a relationship back at home. They were both men with lives that existed outside this floating metal sanctuary. Ellis thought of his girlfriend's voice messages, the way she teased him about coming back famous, the way she said she couldn't wait to hold him again. On the day they came back to Earth, they still didn't talk about it. They were strapped in side by side, bodies held tight by restraints, shoulders close enough to feel through the padding. Their travel capsule hummed, then shook, systems warming up and counting down. The voice of Ellis stayed steady over communications with mission control, reading through the checklist like he always did. Mays answered each call clean and calm, hands sheer where they rested against the console. As the capsule disengaged and the space station slipped away above them, Ellis felt it before he thought it. It was Mays grabbing his hand. Quietly, their fingers found each other between the restraints. Not dramatic, not desperate, just a brief, human instinct in the seconds before everything changed. They held on as the capsule began its descent, as Earth's atmosphere caught them and the shaking intensified. Heat pressed in. Gravity returned in brutal waves. The roar filled the cabin, drowning out everything else. Ellis felt the squeeze of Mays's hand tighten. Ellis answered by squeezing right back. It lasted only as long as it could. The moment the capsule slammed into the ocean, the world rushed back in. Procedures snapping into place. The reality of cameras, recovery teams, history waiting just outside the hatch. They let go. By the time the capsule was open, their hands were back where they were supposed to be, separate and professional. Bright light flooded in. The door swung wide. Air and noise and shouting voices poured through. They were pulled out one by one, helped into the open, water dripping from the capsule as cameras flashed and names were called. Hands clapped shoulders, faces appeared, smiling, shouting congratulations. They were heroes returning from orbit. Ellis stood upright, blinking against the light, his expression composed. Mays followed moments later, steady on his feet, offering the practiced smile the world expected. No one saw the space where their hands had been. No one heard the quiet echo of what they'd held on to all the way down. And as they were led away from the capsule, separated by steps, by people, by gravity itself, the memory stayed with them both. That for a few violent, beautiful minutes, they had descended through fire, holding on to each other, and then let go before the world could notice. Ellis saw his girlfriend in the crowd and threw his arms around her in a tight embrace that smelled like earth, her perfume, the sunshine, and clean laundry. He held her, kissed her cheek, let himself be a person the world understood. Across the room, Mays saw his partner touching his face like he couldn't believe he was real. Ellis watched the interaction and felt something complicated twist in his chest. Something that wasn't exactly jealousy. Something like grief for a version of life that had been possible only in orbit. They didn't touch on Earth. They didn't even look at each other for long in public. Their secret, they believed, stayed in outer space. Then they were dragged into a private meeting with their chief commander. Ellis arrived first. The conference room was too bright, too normal, too full of the kind of cleanliness that made everything feel exposed. The commander sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression neutral. Mays entered a minute later, shoulders squared, face calm. His eyes flicked to Ellis and away. The commander's tone was professional. Congratulations on a successful mission. You both showed strong character under pressure. Ellis kept his voice even. Thank you, sir. Mays echoed softly. Thank you. The commander leaned back slightly as if this were routine. The agency is pleased. The public is pleased. You'll be in press cycles for weeks. The commander continued. Before any mission footage from the space station is archived or released beyond internal channels, it crosses my desk. Ellis felt his pulse jump, but his face stayed neutral. Mays swallowed once. The commander's eyes moved between them without urgency. I review all footage. I'm the only person who sees the full record before it's cut, approved, and distributed. In his measured, careful way, the chief commander made it clear he had seen everything that happened on the space station, and that it wasn't his first time seeing more than a mission report ever recorded. There were many flights, many crews, many moments that never left orbit. Whatever Ellis and Mays were worried about would stay exactly where it belonged. The commander stood, already finished. Get some rest, he said. You both have earned it. As they turned to leave, he added one last thing. You both showed a great deal of care for one another up there. That was it. They were dismissed. They didn't speak in the hallway. The brightness was too harsh, the space too public. Ellis walked fast. Mays followed. They ducked into the nearest empty room, a storage space barely big enough to stand in, and the door slid shut behind them. The silence in the room pressed in on them all at once. Mays turned first, Voice low but steady. He saw us. Ellis nodded. He did, but he's keeping the footage hidden so it won't hurt our careers. Ellis rubbed his face, tired. He making sure no one else would ever see it. The footage won't come out. Our lives won't blow up. And that matters. Mays looked at him, eyes sharp but soft underneath. Is that what matters most to you? What about us? Ellis didn't answer right away. His chest felt tight, crowded with too many things at once. Relief that they weren't exposed. Grief that the moment was already ending. Fear of what wanting more might cost. Finally, he said the part he'd been holding back. I'm not pretending you didn't matter to me. You did. You do. He swallowed. But us getting away with it feels like a sign. Like we should stop here. Take the blessing. Be friends. Mays stared at him, hurt flashing across his face before he could hide it. That's bullshit, and you know it. You don't get to call this being responsible when what you really mean is being scared. You don't feel something this real and then decide it should be smaller just because it's inconvenient. The room felt too small for everything they weren't saying. Mays said, I wish I could lean on you right now. I wish we didn't have to carry this by ourselves. Something in Ellis broke open. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pulled Mays in and kissed him, hands gripping like they needed to make sure the other one was real. Mays kissed him back without hesitation, pouring everything he'd been holding in. Love, frustration, longing, hope. For a second, it felt like they were in space again, like nothing was pulling them apart. Then Ellis pulled back. I can't do this, he said quietly. Not like this. Ellis opened the door and left. He didn't look back. That night, Ellis lay in a hotel room beside his girlfriend. The room smelled like detergent and city air. She slept with her hand on his chest, holding the version of him that had come home. Ellis stared at the ceiling, listening to traffic, thinking about red light and heat and hands held through fire. Across the city, Mays lay beside his partner, answering questions, smiling when expected, doing everything right. But when the room went quiet, something inside him stayed awake. What they'd shared wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a scandal. It was real. The world moved on. Press, praise, and celebration. But somewhere beneath all that noise, something remained between them. Not resolved, not erased, but a close memory. Here's the next story in this compilation.
The gym at night belonged to a different set of rules. For Luke, it was the hour when being watched felt inevitable and desire felt like part of the job. For Ray, it was the quiet during a closing shift when responsibility loosened just enough to make wanting something feel possible and dangerous. Tonight, the lights were lower, and whatever line was about to be crossed wouldn't be easy to step back over. Ray had always known that. He felt it when the last lock clicked into place and the building settled into its after-hours hum, machines idling low, lights dimmed just enough to soften edges and sharpen intent. During the day, the gym was about discipline and routine. At night, it told the truth. Ray finished his first walkthrough and headed toward the locker rooms, already planning his exit. He'd earned a quiet night. He deserved one. The sauna door was fogged over. That should have been his warning. He paused, hand hovering on the handle, already knowing who was inside. Luke had a habit of stretching the end of his workouts, of lingering where rules thinned out. Ray told himself he was imagining it, told himself heat and steam made everyone look tempting. The door opened with a low hiss. Luke sat on the upper bench, towel slung low on his hips, elbows braced on his knees. Sweat rolled freely down his chest, catching in the lines of muscle like it had nowhere better to be. He looked relaxed, too relaxed for someone who knew better. Ray stepped in anyway, the door shut behind him, soft but final. Heat wrapped around Ray instantly, thick and unapologetic, the kind that stripped patience and left impulse standing alone. He sat on the lower bench. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was alert. Luke leaned back, stretching his legs open, the towel moving slightly. Ray clocked it and cursed himself for noticing. Ray had spent most of his life being the responsible one, the man who kept keys, followed schedules, cleaned up after other people's choices. What he wanted, standing there in the heat, was simple and reckless, to be wanted without needing to earn it. Luke watched him through the steam, eyes steady, amused. Luke liked knowing what his presence did to a room. He told himself this was just proximity and heat, but the truth was sharper. He wanted to see how far Ray would go. Luke reached for the ladle and poured water over the stones. The steam hit hard. Ray's breath gasped as heat surged, skin tightening, pulse jumping. Luke didn't look away. The bench suddenly felt too narrow. Ray shifted, forearms resting on his thighs, knees spreading without permission. Luke mirrored him, not quite touching, close enough to register. The danger was sweating between them. Luke leaned forward, crowding Ray's space without laying a hand on him. That restraint felt intentional, like a dare. When Luke's knee brushed Ray's, just a graze, light and testing, Ray didn't move. That was the moment, the exact second things tipped. Ray stood abruptly, breaking the spell before it could finish the job. He muttered something about closing up the gym, about how late it was getting. Luke didn't stop him, just watched him leave like he knew this wasn't over. He was right. Luke was already on the floor when Ray returned to the gym itself. Bench press, heavy weight, slow reps. Luke moved like he wanted to be seen, chest lifting steady, muscles tight and gleaming under the lights. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding either. Ray watched longer than propriety allowed. Correction gave him the excuse he needed. He stepped in and adjusted Luke's form, hands firm on his arms. He'd done this 100 times. But this time, Luke's strength hit him all at once, heat, solidity, presence landing square in his chest before sense could catch up. Luke adjusted easily under Ray's hands. The bar lifted again, slower now, controlled, like Luke wanted Ray to notice every inch of the movement. Ray stayed close, hands hovering, eyes tracking body instead of weight. In the mirror, the truth stared him back. They were standing too close and paying too much attention for this to be innocent. Ray knew he should step back. He didn't. By the next set, the pretending stopped. Ray pressed his hand against Luke's chest to steady him, palm flat against sweat-soaked skin. The touch stayed, too long. Neither of them pulled away. Luke's breathing broke, sharp and uneven, and Ray didn't need to ask what that meant. This wasn't curiosity. This was intention catching up to them. The kiss came soft at first, cautious like they were checking reality. Then it deepened, certainty replacing hesitation. Luke braced himself on the bench, grounding his weight as Ray leaned in, letting want speak, since words would only complicate things. For a moment, restraint tried to re-enter the room. Ray knew exactly how bad this could get. Responsibility clung to him like muscle memory. Luke carried a life beyond these walls, too, one that left no room for this. Still, neither man stepped away. The second kiss didn't ask permission. Luke claimed space, guiding Ray back until the bench met behind his legs. Ray let himself be placed there, not out of weakness, but trust. That shift changed everything. Luke's hands moved slow, deliberate, like he was learning Ray on purpose. When he dropped to his knees, the sight hit Ray harder than he expected. Not reckless, not wild, but chosen. This wasn't a slip. This was a decision made with eyes open. Time softened. The gym faded to background noise. Heat took over, along with the quiet certainty that this would leave a mark. Ray held himself as sensation crested, already knowing this wasn't something he'd shake off later. They found each other again afterward, bodies fitting with an ease that felt earned. Ray ended up pressed against the wall, Luke's mouth warm at his neck, desire unfolding with surprising care. It was dangerous, but not careless. That was the problem. They didn't talk about Luke's life outside the gym. They didn't name the risk hanging between them. Want didn't need denial. It just needed opportunity. The interruption was unmistakable. A door opened down the hall. Footsteps moved past the gym, close enough to make their mistake feel immediate and real. They broke apart fast. Clothes were grabbed. They understood without discussion that this couldn't happen again. Luke left without trying to soften it, taking the heat and the risk with him. Ray stayed to finish locking up the gym, alone now. That was the problem. Some moments fade as soon as they end. This moment wouldn't.
Here's the next story in this compilation. Calvin and Lance are the couple everyone depends on. Not because they're perfect, but because they make the group feel held. They host, they plan, they smooth things over before anyone has to admit something's wrong. Ruben is the friend who stays after the cleanup, who listens without interrupting, who learns how to belong by making himself useful. When desire quietly relocates, when attention drifts from partnership to possibility, intimacy doesn't announce itself. It takes shape in the dark, through choices no one wants to name. This story begins the moment a boundary is crossed, and follows what happens when a secret stops being contained and starts reorganizing the lives built around it. By the time Ruben understood what was happening, it had already happened, at least in the way that mattered. The boundary wasn't crossed when Lance touched him. It was crossed the second Ruben realized he wanted the touch to mean something, and Lance realized he could let it. That's the lie people tell about situations like this, that it starts with temptation. It doesn't. It starts with permission. With two men quietly deciding that whatever rules exist can be bent if the hunger feels justified. Ruben had been telling himself for weeks that Lance was just being friendly, just being charming, just being himself. Lance had been telling himself he was just restless, just stressed, just bored of routine. Neither of them had been telling the truth, not fully. Now they were alone in the apartment Calvin kept warm for everyone else. It was late enough that the friend group had dissolved into night. Coats and laughter gone. The air settled. The kind of quiet that makes a choice feel louder. Lance stood close enough to be unmistakable. Not drunk close, not accidental. Close like he'd decided it was time to stop pretending his attention was harmless. Ruben's body responded before his pride could stop it. That's what embarrassed him most. Not the desire, but the speed of it. Like his life had been waiting for someone like Lance to pick him, and his body didn't care about context. Lance's touch wasn't frantic. It was controlled. He moved with the calm of someone who believed he could handle the fallout, which is the most dangerous kind of confidence. Ruben didn't resist. And that wasn't because he lacked morals. It was because he lacked practice being chosen. The first kiss wasn't an accident. It was an agreement. We're doing this. We're not going to name it. We're going to let it happen anyway. And once that agreement existed, everything else became almost inevitable. Not because sex is inevitable, but because what it represented was. Lance wasn't just touching him. Lance was giving Ruben access. Ruben wasn't just responding. Ruben was accepting a position in someone else's life. This wasn't romance. This was risk. Ruben understood in the middle of the closeness that the thing making it feel electric wasn't chemistry. It was betrayal. What made it dangerous was that Calvin still mattered. His care was still present in the space they were in the fact that this was his home and his relationship they were crossing without permission. Ignoring that took effort. Choosing not to think about him was part of the decision. Lance moved with intention. He wasn't unsure or caught off guard. Ruben reacted immediately, his body giving him away before he could slow himself down. What mattered wasn't the touch itself, but what it allowed. Ruben was letting Lance step outside the version of himself he lived as with Calvin. And Lance took that permission because, with Ruben, he didn't have to be attentive, responsible, or steady. He only had to want what was in front of him. That's what Ruben didn't want to admit. A part of Lance wasn't coming toward him for love. It was coming toward him for escape. And Ruben let him. Because Ruben also wanted to escape the role of good friend, extra seat, helpful presence. He wanted to be someone's problem, someone's temptation, someone's choice. The encounter deepened quickly, not with frenzy, but with intention. Ruben's body shook under the weight of being handled like he mattered. His desire wasn't ambiguous, and neither was Ruben's response. Ruben tried to hold on to the parts of himself that still believed in loyalty, but desire has a way of making loyalty feel like a concept instead of a rule. When Ruben reached the edge, when pleasure overtook him so completely he couldn't fake composure, he hated how much it felt like relief. Not just sexual relief, emotional relief. The release of being wanted without having to ask. Lance stayed close afterward. He didn't pull away or create distance. That closeness made it harder for Ruben to separate what had just happened from the feeling of being cared for. Lance knew how to make a moment feel like intimacy, even if he didn't intend to build a relationship. Lance knew how to give enough softness to keep someone from calling it what it was. When it was over, Ruben was left with the kind of quiet that comes after you've done something you can't undo. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a pause before consequences. Lance looked calm. That calm told Ruben everything. This wasn't going to be a one-time mistake. Not because Lance was reckless, but because Lance was comfortable. Comfortable enough to believe he could have what he wanted without it costing him the life he'd built. Ruben stood there with that truth settling in his chest like something heavy and irreversible. And that's when his mind finally caught up with his body, caught up with the absurdity of where he was, who he was with, what he'd just allowed. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. So how did they get here? It started the way most betrayals start, with a story everyone agreed on. Calvin and Lance were the couple everyone depended on. Not because they were perfect, because they were consistent. They held the group together in small, unglamorous ways, hosting, checking in, remembering, smoothing over tensions before they became fractures. Calvin especially had a gift for making people feel safe without making them feel managed. And Lance made people feel seen. The kind of attention he gave could light up a room. In the friend group, he was the gravitational pull, the flirt, the spark. Calvin was the structure that kept the spark from burning anyone down. Together, they were a center. Reuben came into that orbit carefully. He didn't arrive with drama. He arrived with ease. Someone brought him once, and then he started showing up like he'd always been there. He was the friend who didn't take up too much space, which is exactly why people let him in. Reuben learned quickly what the group was built on, a shared understanding that Black gay community often has to be made, not found. That chosen family isn't a cute idea. It's survival. These people weren't just friends. They were each other's emergency contacts, therapists, party planners, grief counselors. They were the proof that adulthood didn't have to mean loneliness. Calvin understood that better than anyone. He treated the group like something sacred. He made home a verb. Reuben respected him for it. And, without intending to, he began to rely on it. The gatherings, the routines, the familiarity, the feeling of being included without having to perform.
Lance was part of that performance, though. Lance was the kind of man you could tell yourself you didn't want, until you realized you'd been noticing him anyway. At first, Reuben's attraction felt manageable, a background ache, a private thought he could bury under good manners and loyalty.
Then he started noticing Lance noticing him. Not in a way that was blatant. Lance didn't leer. He wasn't clumsy. He was too experienced for that. Lance's attention arrived in small, deniable moments. Checking for Reuben's reaction when he said something, drifting toward him during conversations, laughing a little harder at Reuben's jokes than the jokes deserved. Reuben told himself it was nothing, but nothing doesn't linger. It wasn't just attraction. Lance saw Reuben in a way Reuben wasn't used to being seen, like Reuben contained something worth reaching for. That kind of attention changes the temperature of a room, even if nobody says it out loud.
The first real change happened one night after a gathering, when Calvin stepped away to handle something. Someone calling, something urgent, something Calvin always handled. The group moved on without him, because that's what happens when someone makes themselves reliable. People start believing he can leave and nothing will fall apart.
Reuben ended up alone with Lance in a pocket of quiet. Lance didn't confess. Lance didn't spill his relationship problems like a cliche. He did something more subtle and more dangerous. He spoke as if Reuben already belonged in his private world.
He talked about being unhappy without asking Reuben to fix it. He spoke about feeling restless without blaming Calvin. What he shared was simple. Even while being wanted by others, there was a part of him that felt unnoticed. Reuben listened. Reuben always listened. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't defend Calvin. He didn't say what he should have said. This is your partner. Go talk to him. Reuben stayed quiet because he understood something that made him feel guilty and flattered at the same time. Lance wasn't looking for help. He was looking for a place to put his hunger where it wouldn't be judged. And Reuben became that place. After that, Lance's attention shifted from occasional to consistent. The texts were casual enough to be deniable, but intimate enough to feel personal. The check-ins landed at night. The compliments were framed as jokes. The closeness was always justifiable.
Reuben tried to stop himself. He tried to create distance, but pulling away from Lance didn't feel like doing the right thing. It felt like giving up something he wanted before he understood why he wanted it. And Calvin remained kind, which made it worse. Calvin asked Reuben about his work, remembered details, offered food to take home, made space for him without conditions. Calvin treated him like family. That's the part people never talk about. Betrayal is easier when the person you're betraying is good, because you can tell yourself you're not doing it to them. You're doing it for yourself. Reuben didn't want to hurt Calvin. He didn't want to think about Calvin at all while it was happening. He wanted the secret to exist in a separate universe, untouched by consequence. Lance made it easy to pretend that was possible, because Lance lived like consequences were negotiable. He could charm his way out of discomfort. He could smooth tension with a smile. He could reframe harm as misunderstanding. That was part of his power. He rarely looked guilty, even when he should. Calvin was used to making himself responsible for keeping things from falling apart. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. If something felt off, he adjusted. He worked harder. Reuben began to sense that dynamic too. Calvin carrying, Lance drifting, the group revolving around them like it was normal. The night it happened wasn't planned. It happened because people left earlier than usual and the apartment emptied out faster than anyone expected. Calvin went to bed tired, trusting the version of his relationship he believed in. Reuben stayed behind to help clean up the way he usually did. The moment was quiet, which made it easier to ignore what they were doing. There was no buildup or confession. They were close, they noticed it, and neither of them chose to stop. Lance didn't need to persuade Reuben. He only needed to stop pretending they weren't already halfway there. Reuben knew it was wrong, but wrong didn't feel as strong as being wanted. And that's how the first encounter happened. Not as a sudden crash, but as the last step in a slow walk toward a cliff. Back in the present, the apartment felt different, like the air had shifted permanently. Reuben stood in the aftermath of his own choices, his body still buzzed with pleasure and shame, which is a particularly cruel combination. It makes you feel human in the worst way. Lance moved through the space like a man who still belonged there. That was the most chilling detail. Not what Lance had done, but how normal he looked afterward. As if crossing the line hadn't disrupted his self-image at all. Reuben watched Lance rinse a glass, tidy something small, restore order. It was the kind of thing Calvin would do. Reuben realized something then, and it made his throat tighten. Lance wasn't unraveling. Lance was rearranging. Reuben was part of that rearrangement, an annex to Lance's life, an outlet, a secret room. Reuben wanted to believe he could keep it casual. Wanted to believe his heart wouldn't do what it always did, attach to whoever touched him like he mattered. But it already had. That's why he lingered at the door. That's why he couldn't leave cleanly. That's why, even with guilt burning in his chest, he still wanted Lance to follow him. Lance didn't. Lance let Reuben go the way he let everything go, confident that it would return if he wanted it. Reuben stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut with care, as if gentleness could soften the betrayal. The latch clicked. That sound should have felt like an ending. It didn't. It felt like the start of a new pattern. Behind the door, Lance stayed in Calvin's apartment, calm and untroubled. He was already thinking about what he could keep private, what he could separate, and how to continue without having to fully take responsibility for any of it. Reuben stood on the other side of the door, breath still uneven, understanding too late what he had traded for a few minutes of ecstasy. He didn't know how long the secret would last. He only knew this: it would not stay contained, because secrets don't just sit in the dark. They reshape everything around them slowly, quietly, until the people inside them no longer recognize their own lives. The night opens the way it usually does. Everyone at Calvin's place, because that's where they always end up. Shoes lined up by the door without being told. Drinks poured before anyone asks. Laughter coming easy. The kind that only happens when people know each other well enough to stop performing. This is their standing gathering, the chosen family check-in, the proof that adulthood didn't scatter them the way it was supposed to. Calvin is the reason it works. His home is the designated spot, the place people drift toward because it feels held. He and Lance move through the room the way they always do, as a unit. Easy touches, shared glances. The comfortable rhythm of a couple that's been seen together long enough to feel permanent. Everyone knows this version of them. Everyone depends on it. Calvin is at the center of it without trying to be. He always is. He checks on people as they arrive, makes sure there's enough food, enough seating, enough space for everyone to feel accounted for. He moves through the room with the quiet assurance of someone who expects to be needed and is rarely wrong. Lance stays close to Calvin the way he always does. Not hovering, not showing off, just present. Their bodies know where to land near each other without discussion. A hand settles at Calvin's back. A look passes between them when something in the room turns amusing or familiar. It's the kind of closeness that comes from years of being chosen in public and in private. The kind that doesn't need reassurance or explanation because it already has history on its side. That's what makes it difficult for Reuben to sit through. He's there like he always is, helping, listening, laughing at the right moments. He takes a seat where he won't be in the way. He makes himself easy to have around. From the outside, nothing about him reads as strained. Reuben is watching them too closely. He knows it, and he doesn't stop. He's tracking how often Lance's body turns toward Calvin without effort, how Calvin receives it like it's expected and earned. That's what gets under Reuben's skin. There's something undeniably intimate about the way Lance belongs to Calvin in the open. The comfort, the trust, the way Calvin doesn't have to wonder if he's wanted. Reuben feels the jealousy immediately and doesn't pretend otherwise. He wants Lance, but watching Lance love someone else fully, openly, does something more complicated. He can't have Lance like that, so he sits with it, with the awareness that what he's craving isn't just Lance's body, but the legitimacy of being chosen the way Calvin is. Calvin notices more than he lets anyone see. He clocks the way Reuben holds himself too carefully, like he's monitoring his own reactions. He feels Lance's attention drift, not gone, just divided. It's small enough to deny, easy enough to excuse, but it lands wrong. There's nothing Calvin can point to yet. Nothing that wouldn't sound like projection if he said it out loud. So he doesn't say anything. He does what he's always done. He absorbs the discomfort instead of handing it back. He tells himself there will be time to think about it later, when the room isn't full, and everyone isn't counting on him to keep things easy. The night keeps moving. Plates empty. Drinks get topped off. The group settles into the comfort they've built together, unaware that one person is managing jealousy in silence, another is managing distance without admitting it, and a third is pretending not to notice either of them. When it ends the way these nights usually do. Hugs at the door and promises to get together again soon. Later that night, alone, Reuben tries to tell himself he can handle this. What stays with him isn't the memory of the first time he and Lance crossed the line. It's the restraint. The effort of keeping his face neutral while watching Lance belong to someone else in front of him. The effort of staying in the room without being allowed to participate in the reality he helped create. Reuben understands finally that secrecy isn't sustainable for him anymore. It isn't just inconvenient, it's lonely. He doesn't want to keep wanting someone only in pieces, only in silence. So when Lance reaches out, it doesn't feel dramatic or reckless. It feels expected, like the continuation of something that's already been unfolding between them. They meet again, because neither of them wants to sit with what the group night made clear. This time, there's no pretending they're just checking in. The need is already there, waiting to be addressed. The intimacy comes quickly. It's physical, yes, but what matters is the exchange beneath it. Reuben gives in because he wants the pressure gone. Lance takes charge because it keeps him from having to answer questions he doesn't want to hear yet. The encounter gives Reuben a brief sense of calm, followed immediately by the knowledge that he's more entangled than he was before. Afterward, Reuben doesn't retreat the way he did the first time. He doesn't pretend this can stay contained without cost. He asks for something small. Lance's time, acknowledgement, a sense that this situation between them exists outside of convenience. Reuben doesn't make demands. He tells Lance, plainly, that pretending this doesn't matter isn't working for him anymore. Lance listens without interrupting. He reassures Reuben in the way he knows how, with touch and presence, but he avoids anything that would lock him into a choice. He gives Reuben enough warmth to keep him from walking away, while keeping the future deliberately unclear. At the same time, Calvan is back at his place. He starts paying attention in a way he hasn't before. He replays the group night back in his mind and recognizes details he dismissed too quickly. He notices how often Lance's attention drifted to Reuben. He still doesn't know what's happening, but he knows he can't ignore it anymore. Reuben knows something else too. If he stays silent much longer, he's going to start hating himself for it. What once felt like patience now feels like agreeing to be small. He knows the next time he sees Lance, he won't be able to pretend this is enough. And Lance, who has spent the entire time believing he could manage this, realizes something he hasn't allowed himself to think yet. The version of this he wants may not exist anymore. That morning, while Lance was still asleep, Calvin saw the message from Reuben on Lance's phone. "I need you. I can still smell you on my sheets." With the passcode he already knew, he opened the thread and read, far enough to see how long it had been going on, how familiar it had become, and how little there was left to misunderstand. After that, Calvan keeps moving through the morning the way he always has. Coffee made, space kept orderly. The routine still intact, even though the meaning underneath them has changed. Lance watches him from across the room with a familiarity that now feels heavier, like something being tested without either of them naming it. They still know each other's rhythms. For a brief moment, it almost looks like they could slip back into what they've always been. letting habit and care carry them past what's been discovered, letting the comfort of familiarity stand in for the truth. Neither of them has spoken yet. That's when Calvin realizes something important. Love is still present, but trust is not. Calvin doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't demand anything. He simply stops smoothing the air between them. Lance feels it immediately. This isn't an argument. It's the moment Calvin stops pretending that routine and silence can carry them past what he already knows. He says plainly what he needs and why it can't wait anymore. He needs the truth about what has been happening behind his back, not explanations softened after the damage is done. He needs to hear why the person he has been building a life with chose secrecy instead of honesty, and why Calvin had to find out the way he did. Calvin doesn't beg. He doesn't raise his voice. He makes one thing clear. He will not stay in a relationship where he is being lied to, sidelined, or quietly replaced. Whatever is happening has to be named, and it has to be named now. Lance listens, but he's already trying to find an answer that lets him keep his life the way it is. He wants sympathy without accountability. He wants understanding without having to make a real change. He explains himself carefully, choosing words that soften what he's done and avoid naming what it has cost the person standing in front of him. But for the first time, charm doesn't help him. Lance realizes that choosing Calvin would require something he has avoided for a long time: full emotional exposure. He would have to be known in ways that limit him, that demand he live inside his choices instead of around them. And he cannot do it. Not today. Maybe not ever. Calvin sees the hesitation and understands it for what it is: a refusal to step fully into the love that's been offered to him with consistency and care. Calvin ends the relationship without hesitation or negotiation. Not because the love is gone, but because love is no longer enough to justify staying. He understands in that moment that holding on would mean accepting less than he deserves, and he refuses to do that to himself. Elsewhere, Reuben is also coming to clarity. He sits alone with the knowledge that wanting someone quietly does not turn into love just because you are patient. He thinks about the way Lance reached for him in private, the way that closeness felt urgent and consuming, and how quickly it became clear that urgency did not translate into protection. Reuben finally understands what he was actually asking for. It was never secrecy or excitement. It was legitimacy. He wanted to be wanted where it counted, to be held without having to hide, to matter without conditions attached. Lance cannot give him that. The realization lands hard. Reuben has to face what he did without softening it for himself. Wanting love didn't make him weak, but the way he went looking for it mattered. He wasn't just caught up in longing. He was sleeping with someone else's partner, someone who belonged to a friend who had trusted him. Reuben doesn't try to explain himself when the group pulls away. He knows what he participated in. Calvin tells one person the truth of what Lance and Reuben did, and by the end of the day, the rest of the friend group knows. Once the truth is no longer avoided, nothing goes back to normal. There is no dramatic confrontation, but there is a clear line drawn. The friend group doesn't debate it. There's no meeting, no vote. Lance and Reuben are no longer welcome in the space they all once shared. Lance finds himself isolated in a way he has never experienced before, simply removed from the circle that once protected him. Desire didn't save him. Charm didn't soften the outcome. There's no one left willing to buffer the consequences of his decisions. This story closes at Calvin's place again, but the energy is different now. Calvin now understands. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. Love that asks you to shrink yourself is not care, and choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is self-respect.
Here's the next story in this compilation. Zane arrived at the retreat with a suitcase that was half full and a life that felt temporarily unassigned.
The wellness resort sat just outside a city in Mexico, positioned carefully between jungle and curated calm. The kind of place designed to make people believe they were choosing rest rather than running from something. Everything about it suggested intention. Neutral colors, low voices, staff trained to anticipate without intruding. Guests were encouraged to slow down, to let go, to trust the process. Zane had booked the trip 2 weeks after being laid off from his job. Not immediately, he wasn't that reckless, but after the shock wore off enough for the silence to set in. After the emails stopped coming. After his calendar emptied in a way that felt less like freedom and more like erasure. He told himself this was just a pause, a chance to think, a way to avoid explaining himself to people who didn't know what to say anyway. He didn't tell anyone how much of his savings he'd used to pay for this trip. Kevin arrived the same day, though they haven't met yet. Kevin came alone, which was a choice that still felt new enough to require explanation, even if only to himself. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier, long enough for the reality to settle in, but not long enough for the emotional residue to clear. His children were with their mother this week, absorbed into routines that no longer required him. This trip had been framed, carefully, as a reset, a way to be someone other than a parent or an ex-husband for a few days. He chose the resort because it promised quiet bliss, because it was far enough away to justify not checking in constantly, because it offered structure without obligation. Kevin had spent most of his adult life managing outcomes. This trip felt like an acceptable deviation. They were different men, arriving for different reasons, but the environment flattened those differences soon. At check-in, they were simply guests, given wristbands, offered chilled towels. The first night passed without consequence. Zane slept lightly, waking early out of habit. Kevin slept deeply, his body accustomed to rest once it was permitted. By morning, both of them found themselves awake before sunrise, moving through the resort with the quiet purpose of men who did not yet know they were about to matter to each other. The massage appointment was incidental, a half-off promotion offered for early risers, a small indulgence that felt justifiable because of the discount, because of the hour, because it could be explained later as self-care rather than impulse. Zane signed up because it felt practical. Kevin because it felt harmless. The room was dim and cool, scented faintly with citrus and something green Zane couldn't name. The room carried a calm so intentional it eased anxiety out of him, lowering his guard before he thought to resist it. Zane lay face down, his thoughts still loosely tethered to the life he'd left behind. Kevin settled onto the table beside him, his movements unhurried, familiar with taking up space quietly. They were separated by a thin curtain. Conversation wasn't encouraged, but the early hour loosened the rules. A comment passed between them about the discount, about how neither of them would usually be awake this early on vacation. It should have ended there. Instead, It continued. Names were exchanged. Basic facts. Kevin mentioned his kids, the way someone might mention the weather. Zane said he worked in tech and let the sentence trail off, the truth waiting just beyond it. What neither of them acknowledged, what the narration makes clear now, was how quickly the room shifted from neutral to intimate. Not through touch or flirtation, but through the simple, startling act of being seen when neither of them was prepared for it. When the massage ended, the space they had shared vanished too quickly. They dressed, exchanged polite smiles, and wished each other a good day. Neither of them believed this moment would be their last encounter. What they didn't know yet, what the environment was designed to conceal, was that this week would rearrange the way each of them understood connection, that the resort's promise of rest would be honored, but not in the way either man expected. Zane did not expect to see Kevin again that morning. The resort was large enough to make repetition feel optional, its paths winding deliberately to discourage routine. Guests were encouraged to drift rather than return. Still, when Zane stepped into the breakfast area, balancing a plate he had assembled without appetite, Kevin was already there, seated at a small table near the edge, coffee untouched, gaze unfocused. They acknowledged each other without surprise. There was no greeting that suggested intention, no sense that either of them had arrived early in hopes of running into the other. They simply made room. Zane set his plate down. Kevin shifted his chair slightly. When they spoke again, it felt like the conversation had never stopped, only paused. They talked first about the resort food, how it cost too much and tasted too plain, then about how early it was, laughing at the fact that they were both up and coherent on what was supposed to be a vacation for them both. Zane noticed distantly how long it had been since conversation had felt like this. Unperformative. There was no professional calculus running beneath it. No need to position himself advantageously. Kevin asked questions that weren't tests, and Zane answered without feeling judged. The ease of their conversations caught them both off guard. They finished breakfast together, talking until the breakfast area closed. Later, by the pool, the day unfolded in pieces rather than plans. Zane floated on his back, letting the sun anchor him in his body, his thoughts slowing enough to feel manageable. Kevin joined him at the edge, feet in the water, sleeves rolled up. They spoke intermittently, lapsing easily into silence. Zane noticed how Kevin took up space, neither bold nor apologetic, just sure of himself. It spoke to a life shaped by acceptance. The contrast between them was subtle. Kevin ordered drinks without hesitation, his choices unburdened by internal negotiation. Zane, in his head, felt himself tally every indulgence, the knowledge that pleasure had become a finite resource since being laid off. Still, he accepted the drink when Kevin offered one, noting how good it felt to stop explaining himself even in his own head. The afternoon blurred into evening. Karaoke arrived the way it always did, announced cheerfully, framed as optional, impossible to avoid. Kevin went first, choosing a song that matched his age and temperament, his voice steady, confident, unselfconscious. Zane followed later, selecting something newer, his nerves smoothing as the music carried him. The applause felt warmer than deserved. Afterward, there were margaritas, then another. The atmosphere loosened, laughter becoming easier, less guarded. When Kevin's hand settled briefly at Zane's back as he leaned in to speak, the contact registered as welcomed flirtation. Zane understood then that something was pulling them closer. The decision to leave the resort bar together was made without any real discussion. Kevin's room was closer, so that's where they headed. Vacation had a way of dulling consequence, turning choices into something that felt harmless. Inside the room, the intimacy unfolded without rush or performance. Kevin moved at the pace of someone who knew what he wanted and did not need to chase it. Zane leaned into the moment not because he needed it, but because he wanted it. Afterward, they lay side by side, conversation drifting toward neutral ground. Movies, travel, places they had loved. The kind of talk that filled space without asking to be interpreted. Zane told himself this was temporary. Kevin told himself the same. Morning arrived gently. They woke without alarm, light filtering into the room in a way that made time feel negotiable. Zane noticed the ease with which Kevin moved through the morning, unhurried, settled. It stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to longing. They separated their bodies without awkwardness, agreeing loosely to meet each other later. Not making plans felt like they were still maintaining their vacation mask. By midday, they found each other again. Lunch stretched longer than planned. Conversation deepened almost imperceptibly. Zane mentioned work. He spoke of the layoffs casually. Kevin listened without rushing to fix or solve anything, without reframing the loss as opportunity. He just listened to Zane. That restraint mattered. The second time they were together, the intimacy carried more weight. There was less joking afterward, more tenderness. Zane noticed how his body responded to intimacy with Kevin. It gave him a desire to stay, to extend the moment beyond its current physical boundaries. Even though Zane didn't articulate it, Kevin noticed it anyway. The days settled into rhythm. Breakfasts together without discussion. Long stretches by the pool. Walks that extended beyond the sunset. Soon, it no longer mattered whether they'd found each other by chance or by choice. Staff began greeting them as a pair, a detail Zane registered with a quiet thrill and an undercurrent of unease. Zane began to imagine what it would feel like not to say goodbye, not thinking it could happen, just as a thought experiment, a way of testing whether hope still functioned. The suggestion for the excursion came from one of the resort guides, offered lightly as a way to spend the day at nearby ruins, a swim in a cenote, and Zane said yes without hesitation. The ease of it lingering between them as the world beyond the resort began to take shape. Dusty roads replaced manicured paths. The heat felt less managed, the quiet less curated. Zane found himself watching Kevin instead of the landscape, noticing how comfortably he engaged with the unfamiliar. Kevin, in turn, noticed Zane's silence, not withdrawal, but his processing. The ruins were impressive in a way that resisted spectacle. Ancient stone, worn smooth by time. The guide spoke about cycles, about rise and collapse, about how permanence was always relative. Zane listened more closely than he expected to. Standing beside Kevin, he felt contextualized rather than diminished. The cenote came later. Cool water cutting through the heat. The enclosed space amplified every sound, every movement. Zane admitted finally that he didn't know what came next for him. Not just professionally, personally. Kevin listened without offering certainty, offering presence instead. That night, something changed. The intimacy that followed was more exposed, Zane stopped pretending he didn't care. Kevin stopped pretending care was consequence-free. They lay together afterward without filling the space with conversation. Zane understood then that he had crossed a line, not physically, but emotionally. He had allowed himself to imagine being chosen beyond the boundaries of the vacation week. Kevin understood something too. He understood that he was no longer participating in something harmless, that his steadiness, his attention, had become a kind of promise even if he hadn't named it as one. The realization frightened him more than desire ever had. The next day carried weight. They moved through it deliberately. A long breakfast. A swim that felt ceremonial. Zane noticed how easily Kevin fit into the shape of his day, and how dangerous that ease was. Kevin noticed how much Zane watched him now. Not with hunger, with hope. That was when Kevin began preparing for the ending in earnest. The almost question arrived at sunset. They sat on the balcony watching the sky shift colors, the resort settling into evening. Zane traced the rim of his glass. His body relaxed, his thoughts anything but relaxed. He wanted to ask what this was becoming. Kevin talked about enjoying the present moment, about not rushing clarity when things felt good. Zane accepted it because he understood what it protected Kevin from. Later, when they came together again, the intimacy was careful and intentional, shaped by the knowledge that this was goodbye. Zane experienced it as both connection and farewell. Kevin experienced it as restraint disguised as tenderness. Neither of them slept well. The last day of their time at the resort arrived quietly. They treated it gently, as if both understood it needed to be handled with care. A final swim. A long lunch where conversation stayed safely in the present. Small gestures that felt ceremonial without being acknowledged as such. That night, there was no avoiding it. Zane asked the question plainly. Kevin answered honestly. He spoke about his life as it was, his children, his responsibilities, the limits he had chosen to live within. He did not frame them as excuses. Zane listened. He understood. That understanding did not lessen the ache. Morning came softly. They packed without drama. At checkout, the wristbands were clipped away clean and final, as if the week could be ended that simply. Kevin hugged Zane longer than necessary. Zane let him. They parted without promises. Both of them left changed. Neither of them left together. Here's the next story in this compilation. Firehouse 44 sits 3 blocks from the water, a low concrete building that always smells faintly of salt and diesel, and tonight it exhales heat through every open bay as Engine 3 and Ladder 2 settle back into their stalls after a residential fire that burned fast. The trucks are still ticking as they cool outside, metal contracting in soft pops. While inside the station, the men move into the narrow tiled corridor that leads to the showers, carrying smoke on their skin like a second uniform. The shower room is already fogging up when Lieutenant Owen Cole steps inside, lieutenant of Firehouse 44, respected, controlled, and practiced at keeping his attention where it belongs. Griffin Walker was a new transfer to their station, competent and unassuming, and already requiring more awareness than Lieutenant Owen prefers to give. Steam rises from the drains and curls against the ceiling in slow, lazy sheets. Water pounds against tile from several open stalls, loud enough to flatten conversation into background noise. The fluorescent lights overhead blur at the edges, softened by moisture, turning hard surfaces pale and indistinct. Lieutenant Owen removes his helmet first, then his gloves, then his jacket, folding each piece the same way every time before placing it on the wooden bench that runs the length of the wall. He loosens the straps at his shoulders, slides out of his turnout pants, and steps free of them without hurry. There is nothing casual about how he undresses. Every movement is deliberate, measured, exact, as if his body is still following instructions that were written years ago and never revised. He's tall, broad through the chest, solid through the legs, built from repetition and load-bearing labor. Old burn scars ladder across his forearms in pale, uneven lines. His hands are large and blunt at the knuckles, steady even now, even with adrenaline still humming low in his blood. He does not look for Griffin. He never looks for anyone. Griffin Walker enters the shower room with his turnout coat unzipped and hanging loose from one shoulder, smoke darkening the edges of the fabric. His long locks have slipped free from their tie during the call, heavy with water and ash, trailing down his back in thick ropes that cling to his skin. Droplets slide from their ends and strike the tile in soft, irregular taps. Griffin lets the heat work its way out of his muscles, aware of the room and acutely aware of Lieutenant Owen Cole in it. He respects his lieutenant's control, the way he commands space without raising his voice, and he tells himself that the pull he feels is only trust, only professional gravity. For now, that explanation is enough to stand under. Griffin's body carries heat differently. Where Lieutenant Owen holds his tension inward, Griffin lets it move through him. His shoulders roll once, slow and loose, working the last stiffness out of his muscles. His breathing is deep and unguarded. His skin glows warm under the fluorescent lights, marked only by a faint red bruise along his ribs where debris pressed too close before they pulled clear. Griffin peels off his jacket, then his shirt, tugging damp fabric over his head and dropping it to the bench. His torso is lean and strong, defined without looking carved, muscle shaped by motion rather than display. A thin line of hair runs down his stomach. Sweat still traces the shallow dip between his shoulder blades. Lieutenant Owen becomes aware of him the way he becomes aware of changing wind on a fire ground. Not all at once, but through small, undeniable signals that gather into certainty. The sound of Griffin's breathing. The quiet slide of Griffin's bare foot as he shifted his stance under the water. The soft drag of wet locks against skin. He registers each detail automatically, clinically, and then feels something move out of place inside his chest when his attention does not return to neutral. They choose adjacent shower stalls without discussion. Water crashes down around them, turning the room into a chamber of white noise. Lieutenant Owen steps under the spray and tilts his head forward, letting heat and ash rinse from his hairline and beard. Water runs down the hard planes of his shoulders, along the grooves of old scars, over the dense muscle of his back. Through the veil of steam, he becomes aware of the outline of Griffin's body in the next stall. Griffin stands with his head tipped back, eyes closed, water striking his face and chest, his locks darkening further as they soak through. He reaches up to gather them, twisting them once, wringing water from their ends before letting them fall again against his collarbone. Lieutenant Owen does not mean to watch him, but he can't stop looking. Griffin's mouth parts slightly under the spray. His throat moves when he swallows. His chest rises and falls in an easy rhythm that suggests safety rather than vigilance. Lieutenant Owen has spent most of his adult life keeping his shoulders tight and his feet planted as if the ground might give way beneath him. Being a firefighter teaches you to stay braced for panic and uncertainty. Standing beside Griffin, he notices how he holds his body, how he clenches his stomach and wonders how much work it must take to stay that way.
Lieutenant Owen lifts his head and meets Griffin's eyes through the steam. For a moment that feels longer than it is. They simply look at each other. Water beats down against tile. Pipes knock softly behind the walls. The rest of the fire station fades around them. Griffin stands bare and unguarded beneath the water, his long locks hanging loose against his shoulders, darkened and heavy with water. Lieutenant Owen registers the slope of his chest, the way exhaustion has softened him rather than stripped him down. He realizes with a quiet jolt that looking like this feels intimate in a way he has been trained not to allow. Griffin's gaze flickers down, tracing Lieutenant Owen's face. There is awe there, the kind that arrives before thought and lingers after sense tries to catch up. Griffin shifts his stance slightly, water sliding along his shoulders, and breaks their silence. I can't believe how fast that fire moved. I've been replaying the moment the ceiling fell, trying to figure out how we all walked out of that. Lieutenant Owen nods once, eyes still on him. It shouldn't have burned the way it did, he answers. Everything about it was off. One bad minute and the whole place could have come down on us. Griffin exhales, the sound low and slow under the water. Lieutenant Owen watches water track down Griffin's chest. That's the kind of fire that stays with you, Lieutenant Owen says. For a moment, it feels possible that the space between them might fade, but neither of them takes the bait. A voice echoes down the corridor outside the showers, calling for someone. Lieutenant Owen reaches for the metal handle and turns the water off. Steam hangs between them, thick and unfinished, holding the shape of what did not happen. The closeness dissolves into something more work-related as the moment ends. By mid-morning the next day, the street looks ordinary again. Traffic moves through the intersection in short, impatient waves. A woman walks her dog past the yellow tape as if it has always been there. The sky is clean and pale, rinsed clear of last night's smoke. Only the building is left to tell the story. It was a 3-story walk-up that once held families, now stripped down to scorched brick, warped door frames, and rooms opened by force when the fire tore through faster than anyone expected. Lieutenant Owen stands at the curb as the crew steps off the truck with flashlights, pry bars, and handheld meters, tools meant not for rescue but for confirmation. The fire is out, but the danger is not. This is how they make sure the building will not reignite, how they check for heat buried in walls, weakened beams that could still give way, and pockets of smoke that can flare without warning. Griffin steps down from the engine behind him, helmet tucked under one arm, locks pulled back again into a tight tie at the nape of his neck. In daylight, the bruise along his ribs shows more clearly, a dull bloom beneath his skin. Lieutenant Owen notices the scar along Griffin's side, the faint discoloration left by something that once pressed hard and long enough to leave a record. He has always paid attention to marks like that, the kind that tell you a man has been tested and remains standing. They cross the street together. The entrance yawns open, warped by heat, door hanging crooked on its hinge. Inside, the air is cooler,
heavy with moisture. Ash coats the floor in soft gray drifts that erase the sharpness of sound. Their boots leave prints immediately. Lieutenant Owen leads out of habit. Griffin follows without being told. They move through rooms that no longer belong to anyone. A child's sneaker sits alone near the wall, half melted, toe curled in. A kitchen chair lies on its side like it fell slowly and never got up again. The ceiling above the living room sags, patched with fresh boards that look too clean for the damage they cover. Lieutenant Owen raises his hand once, and Griffin stops. They stand there, shoulder to shoulder, as Lieutenant Owen points out the weakened beam where the fire burned hottest, and the floor beneath it has begun to give. As he speaks, one of the men behind them steps forward without looking. The floor drops, wood snaps sharp and loud, a sudden hollow crack, and the floorboards give way in a rush of dust and broken plaster. A section of the floor collapses into the unit below, air rushing upward as debris disappears. Griffin reacts quickly. His hand grabs the back of Lieutenant Owen's coat and yanks him hard, dragging him backward as the floor collapses exactly where Lieutenant Owen had been standing. Lieutenant Owen stumbles into Griffin's chest, boots scraping, his heart jumping, whether from the collapsing floor or from Griffin's quick hands. He isn't sure. For a second, the room is silent. Dust fills the air, thick enough to taste. Someone mutters a curse under their breath. Another guy lets out a laugh that's too loud and a second too late, the kind that only shows up after you realize you're still alive. Lieutenant Owen steadies himself, one hand still lifted, Griffin's grip firm at his back. The contact lasts a beat longer than necessary before Griffin lets go. They clear the scene and call it in, standing back while additional crews and inspectors take over what they've broken open. The tension drains off slowly as the danger moves out of their hands. Back at Firehouse 44, the crew eats late. Paper plates, greasy food, boots still on, laughing too loud, replaying the near miss like a story that already belongs to the past. The station settles one body at a time until only Lieutenant Owen and Griffin are the only ones remaining. Griffin notices the smudge first, a thin gray streak left behind along Lieutenant Owen's cheekbone. A spot left untouched from Lieutenant Owen's shower when he returned earlier. Up close, Lieutenant Owen smells like smoke pressed deep into cotton, clean soap underneath it, and the dry salt of sweat. It should be familiar to Griffin by now. Griffin hesitates. Lieutenant Owen is his lieutenant, the man who assigns his shifts, the man whose name carries weight in rooms. Griffin is still learning how to stand in. The man who did not move when the floor dropped away. Griffin steps closer anyway. "You have ash on your face," he says quietly. Lieutenant Owen does not answer. He knows he should step back. He knows he should make a joke or give an order, but he does none of those things. "Hold still," Griffin says. Lieutenant Owen feels the choice happening inside him before he makes it. He thinks about his rank. He thinks about the crew upstairs who might see them. He thinks about how easy it would be to end this by backing up half a step. But he stays where he is. Griffin's thumb touches his cheek. The contact is careful, almost respectful, but it is not hesitant. He wipes the smudge away slowly, his knuckle grazing Lieutenant Owen's jaw, his palm hovering close enough for them to feel each other. Lieutenant Owen hates how much his body tells the truth. He begins to rise in ways he wished he could control. Griffin's hand does not fall when the mark is gone. His thumb rests there, firm now, deliberate,
as if he is claiming the space he has already entered.
Lieutenant Owen looks at him. "You should not be doing this," he says. Griffin does not move his hand. "I know," he says. The garage door of the firehouse motor hums behind them, metal rolling down a few inches before stopping, loud in the quiet, a reminder of how visible they are and how close they are. Griffin lowers his hand fast. Voices follow, loose and loud. A few members of the crew coming back through the open garage, jackets slung over their shoulders, laughter rolling in ahead of them. The door finishes lifting as they pass beneath it. Light and noise spilling into the space. Griffin steps back first. Lieutenant Owen does the same. By the time the men reach them, the distance is already in place. Both of them turn the right way, their faces set into something neutral and workable, as if nothing at all had been happening there. The moment folds itself away. The call comes in just after dark, when the water has gone black and the docks have thinned out to security lights and the low grind of generators. A warehouse at the edge of the port, stacked with pallets and solvents, smoke already visible from the access road. The wind is up, pulling hard off the water. Lieutenant Owen rides the front seat, radio pressed close to his mouth, listening as dispatch list hazards in clipped bursts. He pictures the place before he sees it. Long, open interior, high ceiling. Too many ways for heat to hide. Lieutenant Owen issues assignments to his crew in clipped, even sentences, addressing the crew as a unit. He does not single Griffin out by name because he already knows Griffin will take the hardest position without being told. They arrive at the scene into noise and motion. Forklifts abandoned at angles, a supervisor shouting over the wind, flames licking along the dockside wall where the fire has found something eager to burn. The smell is sharper here, chemical, bitter, stinging at the eyes. Griffin works the line like it is an extension of his body, helmet down, locks secured tight at the nape. He moves with the same calm Lieutenant Owen clocked in daylight, only faster now, more focused. They cross paths twice without stopping. Inside, the heat behaves the wrong way. It stays trapped near the floor instead of rising, rolling forward in heavy waves before lifting all at once. Lieutenant Owen feels the pressure shift through his boots and chest before he sees it. The kind of change that means the room is about to turn. He calls for an immediate pullback. The radio spits static. The response comes a beat too late. A pallet stack collapses near the loading bay. The sound is sudden and heavy. Flames surge sideways, chasing oxygen. Griffin is positioned near the loading bay, braced against the hose line as he pivots on Lieutenant Owen's call. At the same time, a metal bracket breaks loose from the storage rack overhead. It clips Griffin across the shoulder and ribs as he turns, just enough force to knock him half a step off balance. Griffin drops to one knee under the impact, breath knocked short but controlled. He does not shout, and he keeps his grip on the hose, knuckles locked as he steadies himself. Lieutenant Owen is already moving towards him. He reaches Griffin as the heat surges again, grabs the back of his turnout coat, and drags him out of the line of fire into the space they just forced open. Lieutenant Owen steps between Griffin and the flame without hesitation, one arm extended to shield, the other tight across Griffin's back, the shock of contact driving hard through his own shoulder. Luckily, they make it out together. Outside, the air hits hard and cold. Griffin bends forward, hands on his thighs, breathing shallow. Lieutenant Owen keeps his grip until he feels Griffin steady,
then loosens it by inches, unwilling to let go all at once.
"Sit here," Lieutenant Owen says. The medic is already there, cutting tape, checking vitals. Griffin answers every question clearly. He insists he is fine. The medic does not agree. They peel back the coat enough to see the bruise blooming fast and dark, swelling under the ribs. When the medic says he needs to go to the hospital now, Lieutenant Owen does not hesitate. He turns, calls another lieutenant by name, and hands off command in the same breath. Griffin starts to protest, shaking his head, saying, Lieutenant Owen does not need to ride with him, but Lieutenant Owen is already stepping into the ambulance, already making the decision final. Inside the ambulance, Griffin looks up at him, eyes clear despite the pain he was in. "You pulled me clean out the line of fire back there," Griffin says. Lieutenant Owen smiles. "You did the same for me before," he says. The ambulance lurches into motion. Lieutenant Owen braces himself against the bench as the doors slam shut, sirens rising, red light washing over metal and glass. As the medic works, Lieutenant Owen notices a smear of dirt along Griffin's cheek, a faint mark left behind by the building. Without speaking, Lieutenant Owen reaches out and wipes it away with his thumb, slow and careful. Griffin stills under the touch, watching him, the moment feeling contained as the city blurs past the rear doors. Inside the ambulance, the night stretches open, long and unfinished, as they ride toward the hospital together. The hospital room is quiet in the way only hospitals are quiet, filled with small mechanical sounds that stand in for breathing when people are trying to sleep. A monitor blinks beside the bed. A bag of clear fluid moves slowly through its line. The lights are dimmed, but not off, leaving everything soft and exposed at the same time. Griffin lies still beneath thin white sheets. One arm is wrapped in gauze. The other rests at his side, heavy with the dull weight of medication. Lieutenant Owen sits in the chair beside the bed with his jacket still on. He has not taken it off. His helmet is on the floor between his boots. His hands rest on his knees, open, empty, disciplined into stillness. His eyes stay on Griffin's face, tracking every shift in breath, every small movement under the skin. Time has passed. Enough for the adrenaline to drain. Enough for the fear to settle. Griffin stirs awake. Lieutenant Owen stands immediately. He moves to the side of the bed without rushing, the way he moves when something matters too much to be careless with. Lieutenant Owen speaks before Griffin can try to understand on his own. "You are in the hospital," he says. "You had internal bleeding, so they operated. But you are stable now. You are going to recover." Griffin's chest settles into a steady rise and fall, the shock easing without panic as he focuses on the simple fact of being alive. "The nurse asked if there was anyone they should call, Lieutenant Owen," he says. "There was no one listed on your paperwork." Griffin looks at the ceiling. "My parents stopped speaking to me when I was younger," Griffin continues. "They told me I could come home when I learned how to live correctly. I did not go back." Lieutenant Owen listens without moving, careful not to interrupt, aware that this is the closest he has come to understanding Griffin beyond the job. "I have a sister," Griffin says. "We talk once or twice a year. She does not ask questions I do not want to answer. I do not ask her for anything. The firehouse is the closest thing I have to family now," he says. Griffin looks at Lieutenant Owen. "What about you? Got a wife and kids hiding somewhere?" he asks. Lieutenant Owen goes quiet, but he does not look away. This job is the only place my life makes sense, he says. It gives me order. It gives me rules. Rules mean I know what I'm supposed to do when everything else falls apart. It gives me a reason to show up even when I do not want to be anywhere. Griffin watches him closely, still and attentive. I was engaged once, Lieutenant Owen says. His name was Clinton. Griffin keeps his face composed, absorbing the confirmation that the attention he felt from Lieutenant Owen was not imagined. Lieutenant Owen explains that it was a kitchen fire, the kind that starts small and consumes a space in minutes. He tells Griffin the smoke took over their apartment fast, that the firefighters reached Clinton only after there was nothing left to save. I joined the fire department because I was angry, Lieutenant Owen says, because it was the only way I knew how to work through what happened, and somewhere in that, I fell in love with the job. Griffin listens to Lieutenant Owen finish. He does not look away when Lieutenant Owen talks about Clinton. He stays present, taking in the raspy sound of Lieutenant Owen's voice, the vulnerability of him standing here saying something this personal out loud. It changes how Griffin sees him. Somewhere in the quiet that follows, without either of them noticing it happen, their hands find each other at the edge of the bed. Lieutenant Owen's fingers curl around Griffin's, slow and instinctive, like his body remembers this feeling. Griffin watches Lieutenant Owen's face as their hands settle together, the small tension at his jaw, the way his shoulders ease a fraction in spite of himself. This is the man who runs into burning buildings. This is the man who learned how to survive after the death of his fiancée. All of a sudden, the hospital room door swings open. Noise rushes in with it. Too much energy for a hospital room. 3 guys from the fire station spill inside at once, loud and careless in the way men get when fear has already passed. There he is. Man, you scared the hell out of us. You look like shit, bro. Lieutenant Owen and Griffin separate immediately. Their hands drop and distance returns. Lieutenant Owen steps back into his position of lieutenant without thinking. Griffin leans into the pillows, already rearranging his face into something neutral. The crew crowds the foot of the bed, talking over each other, relief disguised as jokes. Lieutenant Owen stays near the wall. Griffin glances at him one more time before changing his focus to the guys. Months later, the men are gathered around the television in the common room, boots half-laced, jackets draped over chairs, coffee going untouched as the volume creeps higher on its own. The screen shows a satellite view of the coast, a massive storm spinning with slow certainty, bands tightening, the projected path narrowing until it points directly at the city. A banner scrolls along the bottom of the screen. Hurricane warning upgraded. Time has passed since the dock fire. Enough for bruises to fade. Enough for routines to settle back into place. Enough for Lieutenant Owen and Griffin to learn how to exist in the same spaces without drawing attention to themselves. They have learned where cameras do not reach, how long a touch can last before it becomes noticeable, how to kiss quickly, pressed into the shadow of an open area or the back of a truck, hands low and quiet, urgency kept in check by discipline. Griffin stands near Lieutenant Owen now, close enough to feel his body next to him. He knows the way Lieutenant Owen smells when he is focused, musk and engine oil, the faint trace of cologne worn sparingly. He knows how Lieutenant Owen's posture changes when responsibility is called upon. He has learned all of this without being taught. On the screen, a meteorologist points to evacuation zones. The room hums with low commentary. Someone makes a joke that lands flat. Someone else starts checking their phone. Lieutenant Owen's phone rings. He steps away from the group without, moving toward the edge of the room where the sound drops just enough to hear himself think. He answers, listens, nods once, even though no one can see him. The mayor's voice is clear and direct. The city is forming a hurricane task force. They need someone to coordinate the field response across departments. Someone with experience, someone who people trust. Lieutenant Owen does not hesitate to accept the task. When he ends the call and turns back toward the room, the shift is immediate. It moves through him like a switch thrown. His shoulders square. His expression settles into something precise. He speaks to the room, voice even, controlled, already assigning prep tasks, staging plans, coverage zones. The men respond without question, moving instinctively, the way they always do when Lieutenant Owen takes command. This is where he belongs. Griffin watches it happen, mesmerized by how Lieutenant Owen leads without raising his voice, how his strength sits quiet in his body, solid and unshowy, impossible not to want. He feels the familiar mix rise in his chest, pride and want all at the same time. The stolen nights between them, these last few months coming back to him in flashes. Lieutenant Owen's hand firm on his butt cheeks, the way he never lingers afterward longer than he should, the way he kisses him on the forehead before walking out the door. Griffin had hoped time might change that. Instead, time has taught him how easily Lieutenant Owen can step into something bigger and leave everything else unaddressed. Their eyes meet across the room. Just for a moment, Lieutenant Owen gives a small gesture, a look meant to reassure Griffin, meant to say that duty was calling. On the television, the forecast updates. The storm has strengthened. Landfall is projected sooner than expected. Outside, the bay doors begin to lower, metal rolling down with a finality that carries through the building. Radios crackle. Engines come to life. The firehouse shifts fully into motion. Lieutenant Owen stands at the center of it, fielding questions, making decisions, becoming exactly who the city needs him to be. Griffin moves with the others, pulling on his jacket, checking his gear, folding his wants back into the place he has learned to keep them. The storm is coming, and so is the moment when staying quiet will no longer be enough. The storm arrives fast. Rain cuts sideways across the streets, driven hard by wind that howls through intersections and empty storefronts. Power flickers block by block, entire neighborhoods dropping into darkness while emergency lights smear red and blue across flooded pavement. Sirens overlap and disappear. Radios crackle, cut out, and come back on again. Firehouse 44 is already in motion. Engines roll out one by one, tires cutting through water that climbs higher by the minute. Inside the command vehicle, Lieutenant Owen stands over a spread of maps and live updates, headset pressed tight to one ear, voice steady as everything else strains. He speaks clearly, decisively, moving resources where they are needed most. There is no hesitation in him now. This is the work. This is where he has always been strongest. Griffin moves through the chaos with the others, rain slicking his jacket, helmet strapped down, body tuned to the urgency of the moment. He listens for Lieutenant Owen's voice the way he always has, letting it orient him, letting it cut through noise and doubt. The final call comes from a low-lying residential block, where water has risen faster than expected. A structure has shifted on its foundation. People are still inside. Access is narrowing. Lieutenant Owen hears the update and responds immediately, assigning units, adjusting routes as streets disappear underwater. Then the channel opens again, urgent now, conditions changing faster than planned. Lieutenant Owen makes the call. "Griffin, take point on the interior," he says into the radio. The rescue is hard and close and exhausting. Water pushes against doors. Floors give under weight. Hands reach out in panic. But their efforts hold and people are pulled free. Bodies are counted and moved into safety. By the time the wind begins to ease, everyone is soaked through and shaking with fatigue. As dawn presses slowly against the sky, fire engines return to Firehouse 44 one by one, mud-streaked and quiet. The bay doors lift and lower. Men move without talking much now, too tired for noise, relief settling in where adrenaline has burned out. Outside, the city looks battered, but still standing. Lieutenant Owen steps out of the command vehicle and removes his headset. His hands tremble slightly before he stills them. He takes a breath and lets it out slowly, aware in a way he has not been before of how close everything came. Griffin stands near the edge of the open bay, helmet off, rain still clinging to his jacket and hair. Lieutenant Owen sees him immediately as he steps down from the command vehicle, his attention locking in without hesitation. He moves toward Griffin with purpose, cutting across the concrete as if the rest of the firehouse has fallen away. He stops in front of him, close enough to matter. "I did not think this was still possible for me," he says. His voice is stripped of command. "After Clinton died, I believed that part of my life ended with him. I thought surviving was enough." Griffin listens without interrupting, a little startled as he takes in the words he's saying. "Tonight," Lieutenant Owen continues, "with the water rising and people holding on to whatever they could, I realized I have been alive for a long time without letting myself want anything." He looks directly at Griffin. "I do not want to reach the end of my life having only been good at saving others," he says. "I do not want to die without trying to love again." The words land plain and unguarded. "You make me want to try," Lieutenant Owen says. The sky above them clears enough for the moon to break through thinning clouds, pale and steady. A few stars push into view, faint but real. Griffin steps closer. He reaches for Lieutenant Owen's hand with the firehouse behind them and the rest of the crew tending to themselves inside. They kiss. They stood there together, hands joined. Two men still breathing, still standing, choosing something that might cost them and deciding it is worth the risk. The firehouse hums back to life around them. Griffin turns toward Lieutenant Owen fully now. "I want to try," he says. "Whatever this is, I want to give it a real chance." Lieutenant Owen squeezes Griffin's hand in agreement. The storm has passed, and something new has taken shape. Here's the next story in this compilation. The house sounded different when someone was sick in it. It wasn't louder, it was thinner. Every creak of floorboard carried farther. Every appliance click landed like a decision. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath, afraid that if it moved too hard, it might take something important with it. Theo moved through the kitchen like he'd been trained for it. Not graceful, efficient. A man who had learned to turn worry into motion, who could measure out doses, rinse cups, wipe counters, and keep his face neutral all at the same time. His shoulders stayed squared, his expression stayed calm, his voice stayed useful. It was the middle hour of the night when most people's lives went quiet. In this house, quiet didn't mean rest. Quiet meant listening. He checked the pill organizer again, even though he'd checked it 3 times already. His mother's name, Gloria, was written in Maurice's neat handwriting on the top label, like naming the problem made it manageable. Theo poured water into a glass and watched it rise to the top. His reflection looked back at him in the dark window. His tired eyes, familiar jawline, the kind of face people trusted without asking for proof. He had been the stable one for so long that stability had started to feel like a mask he couldn't remove. From the hallway, he heard the soft, uneven sound of breathing from his mother's room. Just a fragile rhythm that determined when someone needed to check on her. He kept moving. He kept doing. Because if he stopped, he would feel the thing he'd been avoiding all day. That there was no amount of cleaning, dosing, organizing, or planning that could undo what was happening. A knock came at the front door, not loud. More like someone respecting the grief on the other side of the door. Theo paused with the glass in his hand. A knock at this hour meant either bad news or someone who knew that night had become their new normal. He set the glass down and opened the door. Nolan stood there with a duffel bag over one shoulder and an overnight tote in his hand, as if he'd packed for a stay he wasn't sure he was allowed to take. He looked tired too, but it sat differently on him, like he'd been traveling with it for years. His eyes found Theo's face, then flicked past him toward the dark hallway, toward the quiet down the hallway. The energy between them held for a second too long. Theo had seen Nolan before. Birthdays and cookouts. Marissa's endless group dinners that she swore were low-key, yet never were. Nolan had always been present in her life, like a constant. He was laughter in the background, a camera in his hand, a sharp comment on his tongue, a softness he hid behind charm. But here, on the doorstep of a sick house at an hour that didn't belong to visitors, Nolan looked stripped down. Just a man showing up because someone needed him. Theo stepped back, making room without thinking about what it meant to invite him in. Nolan walked inside carefully, like he could feel the fragility under the floorboards. His gaze landed on the medication box on the counter, on the list taped to the refrigerator, on the stack of mail that had gone unopened for days because survival was a full-time job now. Theo watched him take it in, watched the way his shoulders sank with understanding. At this time of night, people didn't do small talk. Nolan set his bags down by the wall, still looking at the hallway, like he could sense the shape of what they were all carrying. At the end of that long second, Nolan finally spoke, quiet and steady, like he'd decided to match the tone of the house. "Marissa called after your mom was taken to the hospital," Nolan said. "I've known her too long not to come." Theo looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. "She's been in and out." Theo said quietly, "This last one just scared us all a little more." The spare room used to be storage, old holiday decorations, a treadmill nobody used, boxes of childhood photos Marissa said she'd go through one day. Now it had clean sheets and a blanket folded at the foot of the bed like a promise. Theo had made it up earlier without thinking about why. He had simply done the next necessary thing. That was his specialty. Nolan stood in the doorway, taking in the room like it was too much. Like being offered a place to set down his body felt intimate on its own. The lamp on the nightstand cast a soft circle of light, making everything outside that circle feel like unknown territory. Nolan's presence shifted the room in a way Theo didn't have a name for. The way Nolan filled the doorway without trying. The broad line of his shoulders. The quiet confidence in how he stood there like he belonged in the middle of other people's trouble. It was unfair, Theo thought. That grief had touched everything in this house except Nolan's beauty. The realization landed hard in his chest, then lower, then deeper, enough to startle him, slow enough to feel dangerous. He felt it all at once. The attraction, the guilt, the instinct to step back, the instinct to step closer. Please not this, he thought. Not here. Not now. Not him. Theo turned his face away, jaw tight, hands curling into fists at his sides like he couldn't physically hold the feeling still. But his body had already answered a question his mind refused to ask. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Theo's heat for Nolan spiked. He needed to control himself before anyone walked in. But it was only Marisa. She appeared in the hallway wearing a sweatshirt too big for her, her hair pulled back, her face pulled tight from exhaustion and worry. When she saw Nolan, something in her expression loosened. Relief, sharp and immediate, like she'd been holding her breath for days and only now realized it. She crossed the hallway and wrapped her arms around Nolan without hesitation. Nolan held her with the kind of care that wasn't new between them. Like he'd held her through other hard things before, and knew the shape of her when she needed support. Theo watched from the side, quiet, respectful, invisible. That was his role, the brother, the pillar, the one who didn't need anything. Marisa pulled back, wiping at her eyes like she was annoyed at them for existing. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I didn't even know what to say on the phone." Nolan smiled, small and sad. "You don't have to. I wanted to come. Gloria means a lot to me, too." Marisa glanced at Theo, then back at Nolan, her eyes bright with the kind of gratitude that hurt to witness. "She's asleep for now," Marisa said. "We're doing shifts. Theo's been doing everything lately." Theo's throat tightened. He turned his face toward the wall, studying the paint like it might tell him how to stand still inside his own skin. Nolan's attention followed Marisa's words straight to Theo. He'd known Theo for years. Calm, quiet, dependable to the point of invisibility. But this version of him was different. He was holding himself together with discipline and love. Masculine in the way he moved. Gentle in the way he listened for his mother's breathing down the hall. It shouldn't have been attractive, but it was. The kind of attraction that surprised Nolan, settled low and slow in his body before he could stop it. Marisa exhaled. "Come sit for a second," she said to Nolan. Theo watched them head toward the living room. From the couch, Nolan reached into his bag and pulled out a familiar liquor bottle, holding it up with one corner of his mouth lifted. Marisa let out a tired laugh before she could stop herself. "I brought your favorite," Nolan said quietly. "Figured if we're gonna be crying and shit, we might as well drink a little." Their voices blurred together after that, catching up between long pauses. Stories that didn't require effort. Laughter that surprised all three of them. For a moment, the house felt normal. Every time Nolan's voice, warm and deep voice, drifted back toward Theo, he felt something else move under his ribs. Nolan's presence wasn't just support. It was temptation. It was danger. It was the kind of lust people build whole lives trying to forget. Theo turned back to the kitchen, rinsing the same glass twice, keeping his hands busy because stillness was dangerous. And still, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Nolan had looked at him earlier. Later, when Marisa finally stood, rubbing her face and heading toward her room, she paused in the hallway. "I'm going to try to sleep," she said softly. "Theo, you can show Nolan the guest room." She smiled tiredly at both of them, then disappeared down the hall. Theo led Nolan toward the spare room. They stopped in the doorway. Close enough to read another man's body like scripture written in heat. The language of muscle and breath. The punctuation of shoulders built for weather. The quiet thunder of a chest that had survived things and still chose to rise. Close enough to feel Nolan before touching ever entered the conversation. To sense the gravity of him, the pull of the comfort of a man at a time like this. Theo wanted him the way exhaustion wants a bed. The way grief wants a witness who doesn't ask for translation. For one trembling moment, he forgot his mother's name. Forgot his sister's eyes. Forgot the thin walls. He wanted to step closer to Nolan's body, to let his sorrow rest its head against something breathing, to trade the sound of medical machines and prayer for the quiet moment of being desired back. The hunger rose in him. Two men in a hallway full of medicine and mercy and unfinished goodbyes, wanting each other the way men do when the world has already taken too much. Just human. Nolan looked at Theo, really looked at him now, at the care worn into his posture, the restraint in his hands, the way he stood like someone who never let himself lean. Theo felt the moment tilt. For one quiet second, neither of them moved. It would have been easy. It would have been wrong. They both seemed to realize it at the same time. Theo stepped back first. Nolan cleared his throat. "Good night. Try to get some sleep," Nolan said softly. "Yeah, I'll try. Thanks for being here," Theo answered. Theo turned away, heart too loud, walking back down the hallway alone. Behind him, Nolan stood in the borrowed room, already knowing something had started that neither of them had expected. Hospitals had their own kind of daylight, fluorescent and unforgiving. It made everyone look more tired than they were and more truthful than they wanted to be. Theo hated it. Marisa hated it too, but she moved through it like she'd learned to. She asked questions. She wrote notes of every word the doctor said. She smiled at nurses with gratitude edged in desperation. Nolan walked behind them, quiet, hands in his pockets, eyes taking in every detail like he might memorize the reality so Marisa didn't have to hold it alone. He carried their coffees without being asked. He opened doors. He kept close without crowding. Theo should have felt only appreciation. Instead, he felt aware. Aware of Nolan's nearness, of the way Nolan's eyes kept drifting to him when Marisa wasn't looking. A doctor spoke in careful language, the kind designed to soften impact. Theo heard the limits in the doctor's voice, the careful omissions. The words meant to soften what couldn't be softened. He watched Marisa take it in, chin lifting, eyes wetting, breath measured back into place like discipline. Nolan's hand rose toward her elbow, paused there, offering balance without presuming it was his right to hold her. He watched himself stay still because if he moved, he might fall apart. When the doctor left, Marisa forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Okay," she said, voice too bright. "Okay, we can do this. We can handle this."
She said it like repeating it made it true. Nolan nodded, calm. We will. Together.
Theo stared at the floor, jaw clenched. They walked the hallway back toward the waiting area, past other families carrying their own private tragedies. Nolan lagged behind for a second, then matched Theo's pace. Theo didn't look back, but he knew Nolan was there. Nolan lowered his voice. You don't have to act like you're indestructible. Theo winced and kept walking. That's not an option. Someone has to be the strong one. Theo Said. Nolan replies, You call that love? Theo stopped and turned, and for the first time in days, his eyes met Nolan's without pretense. Theo didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, he didn't know what love was anymore. Not in a way that didn't feel like duty or obligation. He didn't know how to be anything but the one who held things up. They reached the elevator. Marisa patted her pockets, swore under her breath, and said she'd forgotten her purse, that she'd meet them downstairs in the lobby, waving them ahead with tired impatience. Theo stepped into the elevator first. Nolan stepped in beside him. For a few seconds, it was just the two of them in a small box of light and silence. Theo stared at the numbers above the door like they were instructions. Nolan moved before he could rethink it. His fingers closed gently around Theo's hand, quiet and sure. It's okay to feel it, he said under his breath. You don't have to carry it alone. You can lean on me. Theo didn't pull away. He stepped closer instead. Nolan did too. They folded into each other in a tight, wordless embrace, the kind that forgets walls and floors and rules, the kind that feels like sleepwalking. For a second, the hospital disappeared. The elevator slowed. The doors opened. The world came back. But something changed between them in those few quiet seconds. Something Theo couldn't undo. Back home, the house felt wrong without their mothers breathing in it. Marisa dropped her bag by the door, already halfway gone again. She said she'd sleep at the hospital, that she had emails to finish, that the quiet there might help her think. She said it like logistics, like she wasn't afraid to be alone with the machines. And just like that, the house became theirs. The silence moved differently without Marisa's footsteps in it. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, coats still on, hunger finally loud enough to notice. We should eat, Nolan said. Theo nodded. We should. They moved around each other carefully at first, washing hands, opening cabinets, pretending their shoulders didn't keep finding the same small spaces. Nolan opened a bottle of wine like it was an accident. Theo didn't comment when he poured 2 glasses instead of 1. They cooked slowly, their hands touching as they passed the spices. The wine softened the edges of the room, softened the edges of them. They laughed once, surprised by the sound. It felt wrong to feel good, but all the same, necessary. At some point, Nolan leaned against the counter, watching Theo move like he was memorizing him in a language he hadn't known he spoke. Theo felt it. He turned. Their eyes met. The kiss happened like an apology, soft at first, like both of them were asking permission before they enjoyed it. The kiss became less careful, wine on their lips, grief in their chests. Desire rising where fear had been living. Theo's hand found Nolan's wrist. Nolan's fingers tightened in Theo's shirt. They forgot the stove. They forgot the room. They forgot the day they spent at the hospital. They forgot everything except the truth that had been circling them since the elevator. Later, much later, The kitchen was darker. The food was untouched. The wine bottle basically empty. Theo didn't let the moment slip. His hand slid from Nolan's waist to his wrists, slow but certain, turning him gently away from the counter like he already knew where this needed to go. Nolan followed without asking, his pulse visible at his throat. They left the kitchen, passed the dark doorway, entered the living room where the couch was waited for them. Theo sat first. His hand stayed on Nolan's hips, thumbs pressing in just enough to say, "Here, stay with me." Nolan looked down at him, eyes dark, mouth parted, grief still there, but crowded now by something hotter and less patient. Theo drew him closer. He climbed on top of Theo, knees settling on either side of his thighs, their bodies lining up with a quiet certainty that stole the air from Theo's lungs. The contact knocked something loose in him, a low, reckless hunger that had been pacing his chest all night. Theo's hand spread wide over Nolan's back, pulling him down until heat met heat, until every breath was shared, until the line between wanting and needing blurred. Nolan leaned forward, kissing Theo's forehead, then his cheek, then the corner of his mouth, close enough to feel promise, close enough to feel danger. Theo's grip on Nolan tightened. For a second, the house disappeared. Just the ache of another man on top of him saying his name in ecstasy. Theo swallowed hard, his voice breaking under the weight of it all. "You're my sister's best friend. She's sitting in a hospital room with our mother right now, praying things don't get worse. And we're in here wanting each other." Nolan closed his eyes, his forehead resting against Theo's like a confession. "Say stop," he whispered, "and I'll go to my room." Theo's hands came up, gripping Nolan's shirt like he was holding himself in place, and they moved closer. The house had a way of making the hours feel like they belonged to someone else. Time wasn't measured in clocks anymore. It was measured in symptoms, in good days and bad days, in the spaces between medicine doses and medical updates. Days later, Mama Gloria was back at home from the hospital, and she was feeling better than usual, which meant it was also a worse day for everyone else. Better days were cruel. They offered a glimpse of normal, like a movie trailer for a life that wasn't coming back. Gloria sat up for breakfast. She even teased Marisa about the way she always over-seasoned eggs. Marisa laughed too loudly, grateful and furious at the same time. Theo watched his mother's hands tremble slightly as she lifted her fork, and his chest tightened with love and helplessness. Nolan sat at the table with them, comfortable now in the rhythms of the house. He passed napkins. He refilled water. He smiled at Gloria like she mattered not like a patient, but like a person. Gloria's eyes lingered on Nolan. "You're a good boy," she said, voice thin but sheer. Nolan smiled gently. "I'm trying." Gloria looked between Nolan and Theo, then back to Nolan with a quiet curiosity. "You make it feel softer in this house," she said, nodding at the air as if she could point to the heaviness and the way Nolan changed the energy. "He needs that," she said. Theo's spine went rigid. Marisa looked up sharply, startled by the directness. Gloria didn't seem to notice Theo's tension. She simply reached for her tea with shaking hands. Marisa's eyes moved from her mother to Theo, then to Nolan, and Theo felt suddenly like the room had brightened too much, like the walls were too thin, like his thoughts were being projected onto the ceiling. But Marisa only exhaled, shoulders dropping. After breakfast, While Theo cleaned up and Nolan checked Gloria's medication list with Marisa, Marissa's voice softened into something almost childlike. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she told Nolan. Nolan froze for a fraction of a second, as if the words hit him somewhere deep. Then he smiled. "You don't have to do it without me," he said. Marisa's eyes filled, and she blinked hard like she refused to let tears win today. She turned toward Theo, voice firm again. "I'm going to lie down for an hour. Nolan, if you need anything, wake me." "We're going to get through this," Marisa said, while looking at Theo. Theo felt the sentence land like a weight and a prayer. He watched Marisa walk away down the hallway, leaving Theo and Nolan alone in the kitchen again, surrounded by dishes and medication and the echo of Gloria's words. He needs that. Theo stood at the counter with his hands planted, shoulders tight, breathing controlled. The normal things in the kitchen were still where they'd always been, but nothing felt neutral anymore. What they'd done didn't disappear when they stopped touching. Theo thought about Marisa the way she had looked earlier, tired but still grateful. How she trusted both of them. That trust hadn't changed. That was the problem. Nolan felt it too. They were living in the aftermath of closeness turned to consequence. He stood there understanding that what had happened wasn't private anymore, even if no one else knew yet. They weren't just carrying guilt. They were carrying information. Information they would now have to keep from the person who trusted them the most. Theo understood then that what he'd done hadn't made him reckless. It had made him someone else. Nolan spoke first, voice low, testing the idea as he said it. "She trusts us both, but maybe this stays between us." Theo didn't answer right away. "For now," Nolan added, "until things settle." Theo nodded in agreement. "For now," he said, "but it doesn't disappear just because we don't say it." They both knew what they were agreeing to. That night, Gloria's breathing changed. Just subtle enough that Theo woke up from the chair by her door with his heart already racing, already knowing something wasn't right. He stood in the doorway, watching his mother sleep, watching her chest rise and fall like it was negotiating with the air. The house felt colder even though the thermostat hadn't changed. He heard Nolan behind him in the hallway, a soft presence that had become instinctive. Nolan didn't speak. He simply stood a few feet away, giving Theo space to be a son. Marisa appeared behind Nolan, hair messy, face tense. She pressed a hand to her mouth as she watched their mother, trying not to panic. Theo stepped into the room quietly and adjusted Gloria's blanket. Gloria's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked confused. Then she looked at Theo, and something in her expression softened like she recognized him not as the man holding everything up, but as her child. Her hand lifted weakly, searching. Theo took it immediately, wrapping his fingers around hers. Marisa stepped closer on the other side of the bed, taking Gloria's other hand, her eyes shining. Nolan stayed near the doorway, respectful, present, silent. Gloria's gaze drifted past Theo and Marisa to Nolan, and she smiled faintly. "You're still here," she whispered. Nolan nodded, voice gentle. "Yes, ma'am." Gloria's eyes returned to Theo. Her voice was thin, but the words were clear enough to cut. "Don't be so strong you become lonely, both of you," she whispered. Gloria's eyes closed again as she drifted back to sleep. Outside the bedroom, Marissa's phone buzzed quietly with another message from a relative asking for updates. Theo stayed still, holding his mother's hand until her breathing settled back into its fragile rhythm. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, Marissa leaned her forehead against the wall and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob.
Nolan stepped toward her without hesitation and wrapped her in his arms. Marissa clung to him like she might dissolve otherwise. Theo watched them, his sister held by the man she trusted most, the man Theo had been standing too close to in the dark, the man whose presence had started to feel like a door Theo couldn't unsee.
Nolan looked over Marissa's shoulder and met Theo's eyes, just a quiet understanding between them. Marissa pulled back, wiping her face, trying to recover dignity. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Nolan shook his head. "Don't ever be sorry for showing emotions." Marissa looked at both of them, then forced a tired smile. "We'll be okay," she said, like a spell. Theo's chest tightened, because he didn't know what okay meant anymore. Later, when Marissa finally returned to the couch and Nolan returned to the spare room, Theo stood in the hallway alone. He walked to the spare room door and stopped. His hand hovered near the frame like he might knock, like he might ask for something he wasn't allowed to want. He didn't knock. He didn't go in, but he didn't walk away either. He stood there long enough to feel the line between them, a line made of loyalty and grief and longing and all the words they refused to say. Theo knew then the line wasn't about Nolan. It was about who he'd already decided to be. Inside the room, Nolan's voice came through the door softly, as if he knew Theo was there, as if he'd been listening too. "Theo," Nolan said, voice gentle, unguarded. "You don't have to come in." Theo swallowed hard, leaning his forehead lightly against the doorframe, eyes closed. Nolan spoke again, slower, like each word mattered. "But if you stay out there," Nolan said, "don't tell yourself it's because you don't want to." Theo's breath shuddered. At the end of the scene, Theo finally answered, voice barely holding itself together. "I want to," Theo whispered. "That's the problem." From the other side of the door, Nolan's reply was quiet and devastating. "We've already crossed the line," Nolan said. "There's no denying ourselves now." Thank you for listening to Stories Between Us Anthology. You can find every episode on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Rate the show and leave a comment. It helps more people find us. This is part 2. Theo and Marissa grew up in this house as siblings. They lost their father years ago, and now they're preparing to lose their mother. Mama Gloria is still here, still sharp, still stubborn as hell, and still deciding how her last days will be spent. Nolan is Marissa's childhood best friend. He's always been around, always trusted, always careful about the space he takes up. But something has already happened between Nolan and Theo. Something neither of them planned. Something that began as comfort and turned into intimacy. Tonight, the family house is full of friends and family, and everyone is pretending nothing has changed, even though Gloria's doctor has said she doesn't have much longer. By late afternoon, the family home was full in the particular way Black homes fill when something big is happening. People arriving with food and foil pans. Someone already washing dishes like the sink was their assignment. Aunties standing in the kitchen with crossed arms and worried eyes, talking about the Lord and the weather like they could speak this into a different ending. The living room became a staging area for quiet mourning. A couple of uncles sat shoulder to shoulder on the couch, knees apart, hands clasped between their legs like they were holding themselves together. A family friend, one of those women who'd known Gloria since before Theo and Marisa were even a thought, kept refilling a paper cup with water and forgetting to drink it. Marisa moved through it all like a person on autopilot. She kept smiling when she was supposed to smile, kept touching arms and saying, "Thank you for coming," even when the words tasted like chalk. Kept making space for people to say things like, "She a fighter," and "God got her," and "We're just gonna pray," without letting her face do what her chest wanted to do, which was split open. Her brother Theo stayed close to the edge of every room, not hiding exactly, just positioned like he needed an exit at all times. Like if the grief got too loud, he would need somewhere to put it. Sometimes he'd drift toward the hallway, toward the doorway of his mother's bedroom, and stand there, staring at the soft line of light under the door. You could always tell where the room was by that light peeking through. The house might have been full, but that door made a boundary. It made everything quiet. And behind it, Gloria slept on and off. The kind of sleep where the body rests, but the spirit never fully does. Nolan, Marissa's best friend since childhood, arrived at the house just before the sun started to sink, having stepped away earlier so Theo and her could be with Gloria and their family without him in the way. He came in the way respectful men come into a family home during a moment like this. No loud greeting, no taking up space. He held a grocery bag in one hand. Some fruit, a pack of bottled waters, a pack of ginger candies, like bringing something practical was better than bringing himself. Marisa saw him first. She looked up from the kitchen doorway and her face did something fragile. "Nolan," she said, and on his name, her voice cracked a little. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was relief. People had always assumed they were a couple. Growing up, it had been easier to let them believe that. They moved through the world with an ease that read as intimacy. Shared jokes, easy touch, the kind of affection that never needed explaining. And it wasn't untrue. Marisa loved Nolan deeply, just not romantically. She'd known he was gay long before he ever said anything out loud. Once, in high school, she'd tested the theory. She flashed him behind the gym in a moment of teenage curiosity and mischief. Nolan hadn't even flinched, had covered his eyes, laughed, and told her to put her shirt back on before they both got expelled. He'd passed with flying gay colors. Nolan never liked talking about his sexuality, never corrected anyone, never explained. So they let people believe what they wanted. It cost them nothing, and it kept him safe. And in moments like this, when grief cracked the air and the world felt too dark, it meant Marisa could lean into him without anyone questioning why. He crossed the room and took her into a hug that was careful, firm, and real. A hug that said, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You don't have to perform." "How you holding up?" he asked softly. "I don't even know what holding up means right now," she said, trying to crack a smile. Nolan's thumb rubbed one slow circle at the middle of her back. "Then don't. Just breathe." She nodded against his shoulder. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. But she wasn't crying. She was doing what she'd been doing all day, holding herself together. Over her shoulder, Nolan saw Theo. Theo stood near the edge of the living room, half turned away from everyone else, like his body was present but his mind had stepped somewhere quieter.
Their eyes met and stayed there. For a moment, the room fell away. The aunties, the low prayers, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, all of it blurred into background noise. There was only them. The other night they had drifted into each other without meaning to, bodies twisted in passion in the midst of grief and despair. The memory of skin, of hands touching all over. The memory of Theo's weight resting over Nolan, his body warm and inviting, like he had finally found somewhere to set his hurt down. A night they hadn't planned. A night Marisa didn't know about. They had woken the next morning pretending nothing had changed. Theo felt Nolan's eyes like pressure under his ribs. He'd been half listening to hospice talk, then caught Nolan watching him. Enough to remind him that beneath the grief and the noise, something else had been growing. For weeks, if he was honest. After dark, the house softened into murmurs. Marissa cleaned until she eventually disappeared into Mama Gloria's room. She liked that alone time with her. Nolan stood in the hallway with a glass of water, staring at that closed door. Then Nolan heard it, a strange sound coming from Theo's room. Nolan followed the sound down the hall and found Theo, one hand pressed hard to the wall, the other curled against his chest. Theo's shoulders shook, breath stuttering like everything he had been holding back had finally broken loose. It was all of it. The house full of people, watching his mother slowly fade away, all crashing down on him at once. Theo's head was bowed, eyes closed, like he was trying to pray his way out of it and couldn't find the words. Nolan grabbed him without thinking. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into Theo's space and gathered him in, wrapping his arms around him, letting Theo fold into him like that was where he was meant to be all along. "It's all right," Nolan murmured, one hand firm at Theo's back, the other cradling his head. "I got you. Just breathe with me." Theo clutched him, finally letting himself fall apart where someone strong enough was willing to hold him together. And Nolan did. A pocket of privacy. Nolan shut the door. Not hard. He didn't want anyone to know they were back there. Nolan's eyes lifted to Theo's. "You don't have to do this part alone." Theo's mouth trembled. He hated that about himself, the way his body betrayed him when he tried to be composed. "I don't understand how this is happening again. First my dad, and now my mom. I don't know if I'm strong enough for me and Marisa." It felt like grief repeating itself, the same loss wearing a different face, and for the first time, Theo wasn't sure the strength he'd inherited from his father would be enough to carry them through. Nolan grabbed Theo. "You don't have to be your father," he said quietly. "You just have to be you. And you already are what she needs because you're still here." At that moment, Theo kissed Nolan. It was a tender and trembling kiss, like Theo was asking Nolan for permission to be held in a way that wasn't just friendly. Nolan kissed him back like he'd been waiting for it. Theo's hand slid up Nolan's chest and stopped at his shoulders, gripping. His body sagged into Nolan's like he didn't know how to stand by himself anymore. They stayed like that, lips colliding with emotion. Theo let himself have this moment. The weight of his body finally giving in, his breath evening out against Nolan's chest. For a few minutes, they existed outside of everything else, the house, the grief, the names people would put on them if they knew they were tasting each other's lips, hands inside each other's shirts, close to letting themselves go all the way.
There was only this, the quiet understanding of two men holding each other because it made the ache bearable. It felt honest, and for the first time that day, Theo didn't feel like he was falling apart. Morning came bright and almost rude. Sunlight poured through the thin curtains in Mama Gloria's room, painting gold stripes across the bedspread. Gloria opened her eyes and squinted at it like she was offended by how pretty it was. "I see the sun peeking," she announced, voice dry but determined. Marisa, asleep in the chair near the bed, startled awake, rubbing her face. Gloria lifted her hand slightly, making a little gesture like she was ordering coffee. "I want to go outside." Theo, standing in the doorway, froze. "Mama, you need to stay inside and rest. It's a sunny day." "I'm still living. I want to go outside," Gloria said as she raised her eyebrows. Marisa stood, smoothing her shirt like she was trying to remember how to be a daughter instead of a caregiver. Nolan appeared behind Theo, holding a folded blanket in his hands. He looked at Gloria and smiled softly. "I'll walk you outside. I could use some sunlight too." Gloria's gaze landed on him, and something in her expression eased. The backyard looked the same as it always had, which was its own kind of cruel. The same old fence, the same lopsided bird feeder, the same flower beds Mama Gloria used to bully into blooming. After some time, Marisa went back inside to grab her mother's water and medication. The screen door clicked behind her. Theo stayed close to the chair, arms folded, watching his mother like if he looked away, she might slip somewhere he couldn't follow. Nolan lingered a few steps back, hands in his pockets, giving space while never fully leaving Theo's side. Gloria looked at Theo and Nolan, really looked at them, the way she always had when something mattered. She told them about the first time she met Theo and Marisa's father. It wasn't a happy season. His mother had just passed, and she noticed him at the bus stop, tired and lost, standing like he hoped the world would pass him by. Gloria noticed how grief had softened him. She said they didn't fall in love all at once. It grew slowly, out of sadness and long conversations that didn't try to fix anything. Two people finding comfort in each other. She smiled faintly as she told it, like the memory still warmed her. She said, "Sometimes love doesn't arrive when life is generous. Sometimes it forms when everything else is being taken away." Theo felt the words land exactly where he'd been holding his anxiety the most. And his mom didn't need to say anything else. By afternoon, the rain was steady, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Mama Gloria lay in bed again, eyes closed, breathing shallow but calm. Marisa curled up in the chair beside her, and sometime after dinner fell asleep with her head tilted against the wall, exhaustion claiming her. And then Theo and Nolan found each other in the only place that felt private, the garage. The garage smelled like old cardboard, dust, and motor oil. It held the history of the family in stacked boxes and forgotten trophies. A bicycle with a flat tire leaned against the wall. A worn folding chair sat beside a shelf of paint cans. The garage was quiet except for the rain tapping against the metal door. Theo stood with his back to the workbench, hands braced hard on the edge, shoulders locked like he'd been standing that way for hours. Nolan stayed near the door, giving him space he didn't really want to give. "She can tell how close we are. I thought we were being careful." "We are," Nolan said. "We're just not invisible." Theo rubbed his chest, slow, like he was trying to settle something underneath it. "I shouldn't be doing this with my sister's best friend." Not while my mother is dying. I don't want to be the person who makes everything heavier. Nolan moved without thinking. One step, then another step, stopping just in front of Theo. Wanting someone doesn't make you a bad person, he said quietly. It feels like crossing the line I'm not supposed to cross, Theo said, like I should be ashamed for even wanting it. Everything feels wrong since she got sick, Nolan said, even the good things. Theo exhaled deeply. When I'm with you, my body finally lets go. That's what scares me. He didn't mean just now. He meant the way his shoulders dropped when Nolan entered a room. The way his breathing changed without permission. The way his body recognized safety before his mind could argue with it. Nolan didn't respond right away because the truth had been taking shape for a long time. Long before this moment pressed them together. He remembered being kids, Marisa dragging them into the same spaces, the same games, the same afternoons that stretched on without clocks. Playing house because it was what children did. Pretending at roles they didn't understand yet. The way Theo had taken charge even then. The way Nolan had watched him do it. There had been that one time. Too young to know what it meant. Too old to forget it. A kiss that lasted half a second longer than it should have. A look exchanged afterward that neither of them named. Nolan had carried that moment quietly, folding it into the years that followed, telling himself it was nothing because what else could it have meant? And then there were all the other times, hanging around Marisa's orbit, sitting too close on couches, laughing at Theo's jokes harder than necessary, feeling something tighten in his chest whenever Theo walked into a room and loosen again when he stayed. Nolan hadn't chased it. He'd respected the shape of their lives. He'd chosen silence because it was safer than hoping something could happen with his best friend's brother. But being here for Theo had changed the math. Seeing Theo tired and scared, watching him become softer without knowing he was doing it. Nolan hadn't fallen suddenly. He had fallen gradually. Theo barely had time to breathe before Nolan was in front of him, hands warm and sheer at his sides, guiding him in without urgency, but without hesitation either. The kiss found him mid-step. Theo backed into a shelf, metal clinking softly behind him. A box almost tipping over. They froze. The house stayed quiet. Nolan took Theo's hand and led him farther into the garage, away from the door, toward the open space near the wall. He crouched, pulling an old folded blanket from a plastic bin, shaking it out once, twice, the sound dull and soft. He laid it down like it mattered where they were going to land. Theo watched him do it, chest tight, body already forgetting how to hold itself together. "Can I make you feel better?" Nolan asked quietly. Theo didn't answer with words. He simply stepped forward and laid on the blanket. For that night, at least, Theo didn't regret it. He didn't replay his choices. He didn't measure the cost. He didn't weigh love against duty or grief against want. He let himself be held inside the small mercy of someone else's arms and the quiet of a body that knew how to stay. For a few hours, he wasn't a son waiting for loss. He wasn't a brother holding the house together. He wasn't the man who never set anything down. He was just someone allowed to feel good without earning it. The grief didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip long enough for him to breathe. Morning arrived like normal. Light slid through the kitchen window and landed on the table like it always had.
catching crumbs and coffee rings and the quiet mess of people who hadn't slept enough. Marisa sat with her legs tucked under her chair, Nolan across from her, Theo leaning against the counter, one shoulder pressed into habit.
For a few minutes they laughed, just enough to feel like themselves again. Someone teased someone else about burnt toast. Someone reached for the last slice without asking. The sound of forks against plates filled the space where worry usually sat. For a moment, it felt like the house had forgotten what it was holding. Down the hall, the nurse moved in and out of Gloria's room, changing bags, checking lines, speaking in a low voice meant to reassure without promising anything. Marisa took a sip of her coffee, set the mug down, and looked between Theo and Nolan with a smile that was already too knowing. "So," she said lightly, "when were y'all planning to tell me?" Theo and Nolan looked at each other, then back at her, and then almost at the same time started laughed. Not because it was funny, but because pretending it wasn't obvious suddenly felt ridiculous. Marisa rolled her eyes. "Please, between Mama dropping hints like she is on a talk show and y'all disappearing behind closed doors like teenagers, I'm not blind." Theo shook his head, smiling despite himself. "We didn't want to start something. Not with everything going on. We wanted to be respectful. Plus, we weren't sure if it was anything serious ourselves," Nolan added quietly. Marisa waved a hand. "First of all," she said, "I would love this. My best friend and brother. Two of my most favorite people in the world." Marisa leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "Think of the trips we could take," she went on. "No awkward introductions. I already like both of you. This is efficient." She looked at Theo directly, her voice softening. "I love you, and I'm glad you found something good in the middle of all this." Theo felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was still clenched. Nolan reached for Marisa's hand and squeezed it once. Down the hall, Gloria's nurse finished adjusting the equipment and stepped out quietly. Gloria was resting. The day moved slowly, like it knew better than to rush. Phone calls were made. People checked in and promised to come by later. The house filled with that strange, in-between energy, busy without being loud, heavy without being overwhelming. As evening settled, the nurse explained that Gloria was comfortable, that she was resting. Theo and Marisa took seats on either side of her bed. Marisa held their mother's hand, her thumb tracing familiar circles. Theo sat close, watching Gloria's chest rise and fall, the way he had been doing for weeks now. There was no announcement, no moment that demanded attention. Gloria's breathing simply slowed, then stopped. Marisa noticed first. She leaned forward, her face close to her mother's, waiting for the next breath that didn't come. Theo reached out, touching Gloria's arm, warm but still. Peaceful, like she'd decided on her own terms that she was done. Marisa pressed her forehead to the blanket and let out a sound that was both a sob and a release. Theo closed his eyes, his hand tightening, grounding himself in the fact that he was not alone. And somewhere between loss and love, between what had ended and what was still beginning, Theo understood something he hadn't before. Letting himself feel joy had not betrayed his grief. It was what carried him through it. And for the first time in a long time, wanting something didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like living. Thank you for listening to Stories Between Us Anthology. You can find every episode on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Rate the show and leave a comment. It helps more people find us.